Hey friend, before we start tonight, just one small thing. This little channel only exists because people like you decide some nights it's worth curling up with. A like costs nothing but a second of your evening and tells me this hour together meant something. A subscribe means I get to be here again the next time you can't sleep, tucked into your night like an old familiar blanket. Neither is owed to me. You get to choose, and I love that you do. So if you feel like it, tap it gently. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Somewhere in Toronto? A quiet flat in London with the city gone still? Maybe somewhere warm in Sydney? Leave it in the comments. I read them. Tucked in myself. More than you'd think. All right, love. Let's get you settled. Dim the lights, or turn them off if you can. Let your shoulders drop. Your jaw soften. The day slip away. Are you comfortable? Good. Let's go. It is not the great hall you're picturing. I know that is where your mind went, because it is where everyone's mind goes first, so let us set it aside for a moment and go somewhere smaller. A tower room, narrow, cold enough that the water in the ewer by the door has gone to a skin of ice by midnight. There is a woman here, not a queen, not anyone whose name made it into a single surviving chronicle. She's the wife of a minor lord. The kind of man who owned 3 villages and a great deal of debt, and tonight, in the middle of an English January sometime around the year 1300, she's doing something you would not expect. She's counting blankets, not admiring them, counting them. 1, 2, 3, and a 4th folded at the foot in case the night turns worse than the sky already promised. She does this every night in deep winter, the way you might check that a door is locked. And there is something almost tender in the repetition. This small private ritual nobody else in the household ever sees. Here is the detail that tends to surprise people. The bed itself, in a chamber like this, was not simply a mattress and some blankets thrown over it. It was closer to a small room within the room. Heavy curtains, sometimes wool, sometimes a coarser worsted, hung from a wooden frame on all 4 sides and could be drawn shut completely once the household had settled for the night, turning the bed into its own sealed pocket of air. Once those curtains closed, the space inside warmed with nothing but the bodies within it, and whatever heat still clung to a heated stone or a warming pan slid beneath the sheets an hour before, fully enclosed, drawn tight against every draught the stone walls let in. It's a strange thing to picture now, a bed as an actual room, but that is precisely what it was. And for a woman lying inside one on a night this cold, those curtains were doing as much work as any fire across the chamber. Maybe she's newly married, still learning the particular silences of a husband she barely knows, still working out which of his moods mean something and which mean nothing at all. Maybe she's a woman further along in the marriage, the kind of quiet, competent lady who runs the whole household from behind her husband's louder decisions, and who has learned exactly how many blankets this room needs by the 3rd week of December, because she has done this dance 12 winters running. Maybe she is somewhere in between, neither new nor old to the role, just tired in the particular way that comes from managing a household that depends on her noticing things before they become problems. You might be any of these women on any given cold night of your own. That is rather the point. There is a warming pan on the small table beside the bed, a shallow copper vessel with a long handle and a hinged lid pierced through with small holes, and it still holds a memory of heat from the coals a servant filled it with perhaps an hour ago. She ran it beneath the sheets herself before undressing, sliding it in slow circles across the linen the way her own mother taught her, careful never to let the metal itself touch the fabric long enough to scorch it. Scorched sheets in a household like this were not a small mistake. Linen was expensive, spun and woven by hand, and a burn mark meant either mending or replacing, both costly in a way that made her genuinely careful with the pan, even now, even after years of practice. And here is the paradox nobody quite prepares you for. This woman, whose husband owns 3 villages, whose chamber has glass in at least 1 window, whose bed is hung with curtains thick enough to seal out a Yorkshire winter, is not, on this particular night, actually the warmest woman in the house. That distinction, strange as it sounds, likely belongs to someone 2 floors below her. In the servants' quarters, tucked up under the eaves where the roof slopes low enough that a grown woman has to duck near the walls, 3 or 4 women share a single narrow bed, sometimes 2 beds pushed together, and the arrangement, however cramped, generates a heat no single sleeper alone in a curtained chamber could ever manage. Body heat, it turns out, was one of the most reliable and least discussed sources of warmth in the medieval night, and it worked best exactly where you would least expect luxury to live. 4 women breathing in the same close air, shoulder against shoulder, back against back, created a warmth that no amount of wool blanket could quite replicate on its own. Maybe one of them is a laundress, her hands still faintly reddened from the day's work in cold water, cracked at the knuckles in a way she has stopped noticing, because it has been that way every winter since she was perhaps 14. Maybe another is a kitchen girl younger, still new enough to the household that she has not yet learned which of the older women snores, and which one steals the blanket in her sleep, information she will absolutely have by February. Maybe the third is older, a woman who has worked in this house for 20 years and remembers a different lord, a different lady, a house that in her memory was somehow always a little colder than it is now, though she cannot say if that is true or simply what memory does to winter. They do not have curtained beds. They do not have warming pans of their own, not typically, though sometimes a kindly cook or steward would allow a leftover coal or two to be carried up in an old pot once the kitchen fire was banked for the night. What they have instead is each other, and wool, layers and layers of it, some of it repurposed from clothing too worn to wear during the day but still serviceable enough to pile atop a sleeping body after dark. Old kirtles, old hose, a cloak gone thin at the shoulders from years of use, all of it stacked over the blankets proper, because nothing in a household like this went to waste, least of all fabric that could still hold heat against a January night. There is a particular sound in a room like this, one you would not think to imagine unless someone told you about it. It is the sound of breathing, 4 women's worth, slow and overlapping, occasionally catching into something closer to a shiver breath when the wind finds a gap in the roof tiles above. It is not a peaceful sound exactly. It is a survival sound, the sound of bodies working quietly through the night to keep each other alive, and there is something in that I find myself genuinely moved by, even now, even having read about it more times than I could count. And then there is a third scene, further out still, past the manor walls entirely, in a cottage that belongs to no lord's household record because the people who live there are simply too small to be written down. A peasant family. A single room, more often than not, walls of wattle and daub, a roof of thatch that in a good year kept most of the rain out, and in a bad year kept almost nothing out at all. Here, the fire is not banked in some distant hearth, 2 rooms away. It is the centre of everything. The bed, if you can even call it that, some years is little more than a straw-filled sack laid close to the hearth, and the whole family, however many that might be, sleeps together in a single huddled mass because there is no other way to survive a night this cold without enough fuel to spare. Maybe she is a young mother here, 3 children curled against her, the smallest one tucked directly against her chest where her own body heat does the most good. Maybe she's been awake twice already tonight, once to feed the fire what little wood remains, rationed carefully because wood itself, believe it or not, was not simply free for the taking. In many parts of medieval England, gathering fallen wood from a forest required specific rites, sometimes purchased, sometimes inherited, sometimes granted grudgingly, by a lord who controlled the land the trees stood on. A peasant family did not simply walk into the woods and take what they needed. They gathered what custom and law allowed, and in a hard winter that allowance sometimes fell dangerously short of what the season actually demanded. That is where we are tonight. That is the world we are stepping into. I want to walk you slowly through all of it. The blankets and the bed hangings, the heated stones and the shared beds, the prayers said before the candle was pinched out, and the particular hierarchy of who slept where and why it mattered so much. We have a long night ahead of us, and there is no reason to rush a single part of it. Let us go back to that tower chamber for a moment, because there is more to understand about the bed itself before we move anywhere else, and I think you will find it stranger and more clever than you expect. The frame first. A bed of any substance in a household like this was not a piece of furniture you could simply lift and carry. It was built, often by the same carpenters who worked on the house itself. 4 sturdy posts rising well above head height, connected at the top by a wooden frame called a tester, and it was from this frame that the curtains hung. Some households had testers built directly into the ceiling or wall, a fixed canopy rather than a freestanding one, particularly in older houses where the bed occupied a permanent corner of the room its entire existence. Either way, the effect was the same. Once those curtains dropped, you were no longer sleeping in a cold stone chamber. You were sleeping inside a soft, dark, fabric-walled pocket that trapped your own warmth and returned it to you. I want you to picture the actual process of closing them, because it is a small ritual in itself, one repeated every single night of a woman's life in a household of this kind. She would sit already dressed for sleep and reach first for the curtain at the foot of the bed, drawing it along its wooden rings until it met its neighbour. Then the side curtains, one at a time, each one closing off a little more sound, a little more draught, a little more of the room beyond. The last curtain, the one nearest the small table where a single candle still burned, she would leave open just slightly longer, long enough to see by, and only once she had settled fully beneath the blankets would she reach out and draw that final panel closed, sealing herself into the dark. Some of the wealthier household inventories that survive from this period, and there are more of these dry little lists than you might expect, describe these hangings in real detail. Wool was common, sometimes a coarser worsted wool woven specifically for the purpose, occasionally something finer for households that could afford it, though true silk hangings were rare enough to be remarked upon, the kind of thing a chronicler might actually bother mentioning about a particularly grand household. Colour mattered too, in a quiet way. Reds and greens dyed from madder, root and woad were common enough to be unremarkable, while anything closer to a true blue or a deep, saturated purple signalled wealth loudly enough that everyone who saw it understood exactly what they were looking at. Beneath those curtains, the bedding itself worked in careful layers, and this is where I think the real cleverness of the whole system becomes visible. Closest to the body, linen sheets, and linen mattered here specifically because of how it behaves against skin. It breathes. It does not trap moisture the way wool does, and a woman sleeping in linen sheets under heavy wool blankets stayed considerably more comfortable than she would have sleeping directly against wool, which can feel damp and heavy against skin over the course of a long night. Over the linen came the blanket's proper, woven wool, sometimes 2 or 3 layers of them depending on the severity of the season, and over those in the wealthiest households a coverlet, often decorative, sometimes trimmed in fur for households that could afford it. Minerva, the white winter fur of the squirrel, shows up again and again in surviving accounts and inventories as a lining for both bed coverings and clothing, prized specifically for how much warmth it added relative to its weight. And then right at the very top, sometimes a fur throw entirely on its own, rabbit or fox, or in the grandest houses, something finer still. I find myself genuinely struck by how deliberate all of this was. Nothing here was accidental or simply inherited from habit. Every layer served a specific function, and a woman managing a household of any size understood that function the way we understand the settings on a modern thermostat, without needing to think about it consciously anymore. Now the heated stone. This deserves its own moment, because it is one of those details that tends to genuinely surprise people the first time they hear it. Before the household retired for the night, a servant, sometimes more than one, would heat stones, or in some households bricks directly in the kitchen hearth or a smaller chamber fire, letting them sit in the coals until they held a deep, steady warmth all the way through. These were then wrapped carefully in layers of cloth thick enough to prevent scorching but thin enough to let the heat pass through, and carried up to the bedchambers to be tucked at the foot of the bed, sometimes directly against the sheets, sometimes inside a specially made cloth bag kept just for this purpose. A well-heated stone, wrapped properly, could hold usable warmth for hours, long enough to take the worst chill off the sheets before the sleeper even climbed in, and long enough, if positioned well, to still offer some comfort near the feet come the coldest part of the night, usually somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, which is, interestingly, the same hour modern sleep researchers identify as the body's lowest natural temperature point. Medieval households did not know that number. Obviously, they had no thermometers reading out a precise figure, but they knew the feeling of it intimately, the particular deep chill that settled in during those hours no matter how well the evening had begun, and they built their entire warming routine around anticipating it. The warming pan I mentioned earlier worked on a similar principle but served a slightly different purpose. Where the stone provided lingering warmth throughout the night, the pan was used specifically to pre-warm the bed just before the sleeper climbed in, a quick pass of heat across cold linen that made the first moments of lying down considerably less shocking to the system. You slide into a bed that has been sitting in an unheated stone chamber all day, even under all those layers, and the initial cold of the sheets against skin is a genuine jolt. The pan solved exactly that problem, and nothing else, which tells you something about how specifically medieval households thought through each individual discomfort of the season rather than simply layering blankets and hoping for the best. Bed placement mattered enormously too, and this is something that shaped the entire architecture of a chamber. In any room that had both a fireplace and a bed, and not every room did, the bed was positioned as close to that hearth as the room's layout allowed, sometimes directly against the same wall the chimney rose through, which meant the stone itself, warmed all day by the fire on the other side, radiated a low, steady heat into the sleeping space even after the fire below had been banked for the night. This is a detail I find genuinely clever. The chimney breast, the mass of stone or brick surrounding the flue, held heat for hours after the flames themselves had died down to embers, functioning almost like a slow-release radiator built directly into the architecture, centuries before anyone had a word for that concept. Households that could afford it sometimes positioned the most important bedchamber, the Lord and Lady's own, in the warmest part of the house entirely, often on an upper floor where rising heat from the chambers below offered some additional benefit, but close enough to a substantial hearth that the room rarely grew truly frigid even on the worst nights. This was not accidental architecture, it was a direct reflection of hierarchy, built right into the stones of the house itself, and we will come back to that idea more than once tonight, because it threads through nearly everything about how medieval households managed the cold. There is one more detail about that tower chamber I want to give you before we move on, because it is small and specific in exactly the way I think you will appreciate. On the coldest nights, some households employed a practice that sounds almost too simple to have been effective, and yet by every account it was. A second, smaller fire, sometimes just a brazier, a portable metal basin of coals, would be brought into the bedchamber itself an hour or two before the household retired, allowed to warm the air of the room directly, and then removed entirely before anyone actually went to sleep. This was a fire safety measure as much as anything else. Nobody wanted an open flame burning unattended in a room full of wool hangings and sleeping bodies, so the brazier did its work early, warming the stone walls and the air itself, and was carried away well before the candles were finally pinched out. By the time our noblewoman drew those final bed curtains closed, the room had already spent an hour or more absorbing warmth it would slowly release back through the night, a kind of thermal banking that meant the coldest part of the evening, that first hour of settling in, was considerably gentler than it would have been in an untreated room. I want to sit with that detail for a second because there is something almost tender about it. This whole quiet system of anticipation built entirely around a woman's comfort hours before she ever climbed into bed. Someone thought about her cold feet at 4 in the morning and did something about it that afternoon. That is not nothing. Let us talk honestly about wealth for a moment, because it shaped nearly every part of this experience, and I do not think we do the subject any favours by softening that fact. Survival in a medieval winter was, in large part, a question of money. Not entirely. There was skill and knowledge and community involved too, and we will get to those, but wealth bought margin, and margin is what kept people alive on the nights when everything else went wrong. A wealthy household could afford more wood, better hangings, thicker walls, glass in at least some windows rather than shutters or oiled cloth alone, and servants whose entire job, some of them, was simply to manage warmth on behalf of the family they served. A poor household had none of that margin. Every cold night was a slightly smaller emergency, and every hard winter carried real, measurable risk. I want to walk you through what that looked like in practice, because the specific differences are more interesting than the general idea of rich and poor, and they tell you something true about how medieval people actually lived. Start with the walls themselves. A stone manor house, even a modest one, held heat differently than a timber-framed cottage, and differently again from the wattle and daub homes of the poorest peasants. Stone is slow to warm and slow to cool, which sounds like it might work against you in winter, and in the earliest days of occupying a cold stone building, it did. But once a stone structure had been consistently heated for weeks, the walls themselves began holding a baseline warmth that never fully dissipated, even overnight, even with the fires banked low. A cottage of wattle and daub, thin woven branches packed with a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes dung, held almost no thermal mass at all. It warmed quickly near the fire, and cooled just as quickly the moment that fire dimmed, which meant peasant households experienced far more dramatic swings between warm and freezing over the course of a single night than their wealthier neighbours ever did. Windows tell a similar story. Glass in this period was a genuine luxury, and even wealthy households often had glass in only the most important rooms, the hall, perhaps the lord's own chamber, while lesser rooms made do with wooden shutters alone, or with thin sheets of horn scraped translucent, or waxed linen cloth stretched across the opening, letting in a diffuse grey light while doing considerably less to keep out the cold than actual glass would have. Peasant cottages, more often than not, had no real windows at all in the way we would recognize the word, just small openings that were shuttered entirely through the winter months, meaning the interior stayed dark for most of the short winter days, lit only by firelight and the occasional candle, which itself was too costly a resource to burn carelessly. Fuel was perhaps the starkest divide of all, and I think it is worth sitting with this one a little longer because it shaped so much of what we have already talked about tonight. A wealthy household purchased or produced wood in genuine quantity, sometimes maintaining its own managed woodland specifically for this purpose, cut and stacked and seasoned well in advance of the season that would need it. Fires in such households burned steadily through the coldest months, in the great hall certainly, but often in several private chambers as well, each one tended by servants whose responsibilities included exactly this, keeping specific fires fed at specific times of day. A peasant family, by contrast, gathered what fuel they could, often relying on fallen branches and deadwood collected under whatever customary rites their local lord permitted. Rights that varied enormously from manor to manor and were, in hard years, sometimes restricted further by lords protecting their own woodland for their own use. Some regions allowed peasants to gather anything they could reach without a hook or an axe, using only what could be pulled down by hand, a right sometimes called, in various local customs, something close to by hook or by crook, an old phrase whose origins trace back to exactly this kind of practical medieval fuel gathering. This meant a peasant family's fire was, almost by necessity, smaller and less reliable than a manor's, fed carefully, rationed through the night, sometimes allowed to die down to little more than glowing embers by the coldest hours specifically to conserve fuel for the following day. I do not want to overstate the misery of this. People who lived this way their entire lives developed real skill at managing a small fire efficiently, understanding exactly how to bank coals so they would still be alive by morning, exactly which types of wood burned longest and slowest, exactly how to angle a body and a blanket to capture the most benefit from a modest flame. Skill compensated for some of what money could otherwise buy, but not all of it. Not on the worst nights. Clothing worn to bed followed the same pattern. wealth buying warmth in ways that were both practical and, quietly, symbolic. A noblewoman might sleep in a fine linen shift, sometimes trimmed, and in the coldest months layer a woolen bedgown over it, occasionally lined with fur for the wealthiest households, along with a soft cap or coif to keep her head warm through the night, since a surprising amount of body heat is lost through an uncovered head, something medieval people understood intuitively even without the biology to explain exactly why. A servant slept in whatever clothing she had, sometimes the same garments worn through the day simply because she owned no separate sleeping clothes at all, layered with whatever spare fabric the household could offer. Old cloaks, worn hose, anything that still held some insulating value even in its final years of usefulness. A peasant woman, more often than not, slept in her day clothes entirely, perhaps with an additional layer added if the family owned one to spare, because the idea of clothing set aside purely for sleep was, for the poorest households, a luxury with no practical justification when every garment was needed to work through cold days as well as survive cold nights. And yet, here is where I think the story resists the simple version of itself, because warmth, it turns out, was not purely a function of wealth, it was also a function of numbers, and on this particular measure, the poorest households sometimes had an advantage the wealthy simply could not access. A peasant family sleeping together in a single small space, parents and children and sometimes an elderly relative, all sharing one room and often one bed, generated a concentration of body heat that a wealthy household, spread across multiple private chambers, one person or one couple to a bed, simply did not produce in the same way. This is not to say the peasant family was warmer overall. The walls and the fire and the clothing still mattered enormously, but within their small shared space, the collective heat of several bodies pressed close together did real work that no amount of stone architecture alone could replicate for a single sleeper in a grand, mostly empty chamber 2 floors above. I find this detail genuinely moving, actually. There is something in it about the different shapes survival takes depending on what resources you have available to you. Wealth bought space and privacy and elaborate systems of managed warmth. Poverty, lacking those things, often produced closeness instead, out of necessity rather than choice, but closeness that did real measurable work against the cold all the same. Neither version was easy. I do not want to romanticize the peasant cottage as some cozy alternative to the cold, drafty manor, because by every account the physical hardship of that life was real and often dangerous in ways the manor house genuinely was not. But it is worth noticing, I think, that warmth in this period was never one single thing. It was architecture and fuel and clothing and fur, yes, but it was also simply the number of bodies breathing in the dark together, and that particular resource, unlike wood or wool, was distributed rather more evenly across every level of medieval society. Somewhere in between these two extremes sat a whole middle world worth mentioning, the households of merchants, of wealthier free peasants sometimes called yeomen, of the growing class of townspeople whose fortunes depended on trade rather than land. Their winters look different again, often better provisioned than the rural poor, but without the deep architectural advantages of the true nobility. A prosperous merchant's wife in a walled town might sleep in a solid timber-framed house, well built, reasonably warm, with proper glazed windows in at least the main rooms, purchased wood stacked in a dry shed rather than gathered under customary rite, and a bed with real curtains, if perhaps not the elaborate fur-lined coverlets of a baron's household. Her winter nights held real comfort, earned through her husband's trade rather than inherited through blood. And this growing middle layer of medieval society, easy to overlook when we default to thinking only in terms of lords and peasants, represented an increasingly significant portion of the population by the later medieval centuries, particularly in prosperous trading regions of England and the Low Countries. Every household, whatever its size or wealth, moved through a kind of nightly ritual as winter darkness fell, and I want to walk you through that ritual now, slowly, room by room, the way it would actually have unfolded. It began in most households with the fire, not extinguishing it. That would have wasted precious heat and made the following morning considerably harder. but banking it a specific technique that took real skill to do well. Banking meant arranging the remaining coals into a careful mound, sometimes covering them partially with ash, which acted as insulation, slowing the rate at which the fire consumed itself while keeping a core of live embers glowing quietly through the night. Done correctly, a well-banked fire could be coaxed back to full life the following morning with nothing more than a little kindling and some careful blowing, rather than requiring an entirely new fire struck from flint and steel, a considerably more laborious process, especially on a morning when hands were stiff with cold and patience was already thin. In a great household, this task fell to a specific servant, sometimes simply called the fire boy or the fire keeper depending on the region and the century, and it was considered a genuine responsibility rather than a menial afterthought. A poorly banked fire meant a cold house at dawn, and in the depths of a hard winter, a cold house at dawn was not merely uncomfortable. It could mean real danger for the youngest and the oldest members of a household, whose bodies handled sudden cold considerably worse than those in the prime of adult life. I think it is worth pausing on that responsibility for a moment, this quiet nightly task that so much depended on, performed by someone whose name almost never survives in any record, and yet whose small careful competence night after night kept an entire household functioning through the hardest months of the year in a peasant cottage. This same task fell simply to whoever was last awake, usually the mother of the household, who would tend the fire down to its safest, most efficient state before finally settling into whatever space remained for her own rest. There was no servant to hand this responsibility to. It was simply one more thing she did, quietly, at the end of an already long day, before she herself could finally lie down. Once the fire was settled, the household moved, quite literally, room by room, towards sleep. And the order of that movement tells you something real about hierarchy that I find genuinely fascinating. In a substantial manor house, the lord and lady typically retired last among the family, though well before the latest of the servants, who often had additional tasks to complete once the family themselves had gone up. Candles were extinguished in sequence, the great hall first, since it required no illumination once the evening's business there had concluded, then the smaller chambers as each was vacated for the night. This sequence was not arbitrary. Candles, particularly the finer beeswax candles used in the more important rooms of a wealthy household, were expensive enough that their use was carefully managed, lit only where and when actually needed, and extinguished the moment that need passed. Tallow candles, made from rendered animal fat, were considerably cheaper and more commonly used in servants' areas and lesser rooms, though they came with a real drawback: a distinct, smoky, faintly unpleasant smell that meant nobody who could afford better chose to use them if they had a choice in the matter. I want to describe the smell of a household at this hour, because I think it is one of those sensory details that brings the whole scene into focus in a way that facts alone cannot quite manage. Wood smoke, first and most persistent, clinging to the wall hangings, the clothing, even the hair of everyone in the house, so thoroughly woven into daily life that nobody actually noticed it anymore, except perhaps a visitor arriving fresh from outside. Beneath that, the particular smell of tallow candles if they were burning nearby, faintly greasy, faintly animal, and beneath even that, something warmer and more human, wool warmed by bodies and by proximity to the fire, the faint mustiness of straw in the mattress ticking, and somewhere in a well-run kitchen, the lingering smell of whatever had been cooked for the evening meal, bread most likely, or a pottage of some kind, still faintly present in the air hours after the meal itself had concluded. Prayers came next, and this was not optional in the way we might think of an evening habit today, something practiced by the devout and skipped by everyone else. It was, for the vast majority of medieval people, simply part of how a day properly ended, as automatic and unremarkable as banking the fire itself. In wealthier households, this might mean a formal prayer said before a small household altar or shrine, sometimes led by the lord or lady, sometimes by a chaplain if the household was grand enough to retain one permanently, invoking protection through the hours of darkness specifically. There were particular prayers associated with nightfall, drawing on psalms that spoke directly to fear of the night and trust in protection through it. Verses that would have been genuinely familiar, recited so many times across a lifetime that they required no real thought to produce, the words simply arriving on their own the way a familiar song does. In humbler households, this same instinct expressed itself more simply, perhaps a brief prayer said quietly while already lying down, words learned in childhood and repeated now from memory rather than from any book, since most peasant households owned no books at all and few members could read even if they had. I do not think this made the prayer less sincere. If anything, there is something in the simplicity of it, a tired mother whispering a few familiar words into the dark before finally letting herself sleep, that strikes me as more genuinely devotional than any formal ceremony could quite manage. Now the actual movement of bodies to bed, because this too followed a pattern worth understanding. In the grandest households, children, if young enough, typically slept nearer their nurse or, in the wealthiest families, in a separate nursery chamber tended by a dedicated nurse, whose entire responsibility centered on the youngest members of the family. Older children, once past infancy, might share a chamber with siblings of the same sex, while the lord and lady retired to their own private chamber, the one we have already spent some time inside tonight. Servants dispersed to their own quarters, which varied enormously depending on rank within the household. A lady's personal maid might sleep on a small trundle bed that could be pulled out from beneath the main bed itself and pushed back under during the day, positioned close enough to hear if she was needed in the night, a detail that speaks to just how constant personal service was in a household of real wealth. Other servants slept further away, in shared quarters under the eaves or above the kitchens, where residual warmth from the ovens below sometimes made these otherwise cramped spaces surprisingly bearable through the coldest months. There is something genuinely interesting about that trundle bed arrangement, actually, because it complicates the simple story of servants having worse conditions than their employers in every single respect. A lady's maid sleeping on a trundle bed, tucked close beside her mistress's grand curtained bed, technically occupied one of the least private sleeping arrangements in the entire household, no curtains of her own, no real separation from her mistress's space, required to be available at any hour of the night. And yet she also slept, most nights, in the warmest room in the house, benefiting from proximity to the same banked fire and thermal mass of stone that kept her mistress comfortable, an advantage the cook or the laundress sleeping in a colder, more distant room simply did not share. Status in a medieval household was rarely a single clean hierarchy. It was a tangled set of trade-offs, privacy against warmth, independence against proximity to power, and different women navigated those trade-offs differently depending on what mattered most to them. In a peasant cottage, of course, none of this elaborate sorting applied. The whole family retired more or less together into whatever single sleeping space the cottage provided, and the only real variation in arrangement came down to who slept closest to the fire, a position that shifted somewhat by need rather than by fixed hierarchy. The youngest children were often placed nearest the hearth, since they had the least ability to regulate their own body temperature and the greatest vulnerability to a cold night's worst effects. The parents positioned themselves at the outer edges of the sleeping huddle, in a sense forming a human wall between the coldest parts of the room and the children they were protecting, absorbing the worst of any draft themselves rather than let it reach the little ones curled in the warmer center. I keep coming back to that image, honestly. A mother and father positioning their own bodies as a kind of living windbreak against the cold, without ever needing to discuss it or decide it consciously, simply doing what instinct and long practice had taught them worked. There is nothing in any surviving record that explicitly describes this as a strategy. No chronicler bothered writing down something so ordinary that everyone already understood it. But the logic of it is inescapable once you actually sit with how these small cottages were arranged, and who, historically, tended to survive a hard winter, and who did not. Once everyone had finally settled, the house grew quiet in stages rather than all at once, and this staged quieting is worth noticing too. First, the sounds of the day itself faded. Footsteps, voices, the particular clatter of a kitchen finishing its last tasks. Then the smaller sounds took over, the settling creak of timber contracting slightly as it cooled, the occasional soft pop of a dying fire somewhere in the house, wind finding whatever small gaps the walls still offered it. And beneath all of that, breathing, so much breathing, the whole household essentially reduced at this hour to a collection of people simply breathing together in the dark, waiting out the cold until morning finally arrived to release them from it. Let us return to our noble woman in her tower chamber, because I promised you her story, and there is a part of it she keeps from everyone in that household, something she has never spoken aloud to a single soul, not her husband, not her closest waiting woman, not even in any formal sense, to the priest who hears her confession. She is afraid of the dark in a way that feels to her deeply unbecoming of a woman in her position, not the ordinary caution any sensible person feels about a cold night, the practical worry over blankets and banked fires we have already spent so much time on, something older than that, something that predates her marriage, predates even her memory of when it began. As a child, she lost a younger brother to a winter fever, one of those illnesses that arrived in the coldest months and simply would not release its grip no matter what remedies the household tried. And she remembers, with a clarity that still catches her off guard sometimes, being told to stay quiet, to stay out of the sick room, to let the women who understood these things do what needed doing. She remembers the particular quality of silence in the house during his final night, and something in her, ever since, associates the deepest hours of winter darkness with that same held breath waiting, that same sense that something terrible might be moving through the house without any warning at all. She has never told her husband this. He is not an unkind man, not cruel in the way some husbands of this period genuinely were, but he is practical, a man who manages villages and debts and the endless small crises of running an estate, and she cannot quite imagine how she would even begin to explain a fear this old, this formless, this apparently disconnected from anything actually threatening her now. So she does what she has always done. She counts her blankets, she checks the curtains are drawn fully closed, every gap sealed, as if fabric alone could keep out whatever it is she is truly afraid of. And most nights, this is enough. Most nights, the ritual itself, the sheer repetition of doing something with her hands, settles whatever is stirring underneath. Tonight is not quite one of those easy nights. There was a fever moving through the village nearest the manor this past week. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that has reached the household itself, but word travels in a small community, and she heard second-hand through her waiting woman that a child in the village did not survive it. She did not know the family. She has likely never even seen the child in question. And yet lying here now, curtains drawn, blankets counted and recounted, she finds her mind returning again and again to that old memory, her brother's room, that terrible silence, the particular cold of a house holding its breath. She does something now that she has done perhaps 100 times before, on nights like this one, though she has never once admitted to anyone that she does it. She reaches beneath her pillow, where a small item rests, tucked there every single night without exception. Not jewellery, not anything of real value at all actually, which is rather the point. It is a small scrap of fabric, worn soft with age and handling, cut from a garment that belonged to her brother, saved without her parents' knowledge from among his things after he died, carried with her through every household she has lived in since, including into this marriage. She has never shown it to anyone. She could not begin to explain why she still needs it, a grown woman, a wife, a mother herself now to 2 children of her own, and yet her fingers find it in the dark, almost without conscious thought, and something in her chest, some tightness she had not fully noticed until this moment, eases slightly at the familiar worn texture of it. I find this detail genuinely moving, honestly, and I want to sit with it a moment rather than rush past it. We tend to imagine medieval people, especially medieval noblewomen, as somehow more hardened to loss than we are now, simply because loss visited their lives so much more frequently than it visits most of ours today. Infant and child mortality rates in this period were devastating by any modern measure, and a woman of this status would very likely have lost siblings, quite possibly her own children as well, over the course of an ordinary life. But frequency of loss does not mean immunity to it. If anything, I suspect it meant something closer to the opposite. Grief simply folded quietly into the ordinary fabric of daily existence, carried privately, managed alone in the dark hours when nobody else could see the weight of it, precisely because there was no space, no permission, in the busy daylight world of running a household, to let that weight show. She does not cry tonight. She rarely does. Not anymore. Not for a loss this old. She simply lies there in the dark, the small scrap of fabric held loosely in one hand, listening to her husband's breathing beside her, steady and untroubled, entirely unaware of what is moving quietly through his wife's mind in this exact moment. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that, I think, lying beside someone you have shared a bed with for years, someone whose breathing you could recognize blind, and still carrying something inside yourself that they will simply never know about. Not because you do not trust them necessarily, but because some things, once carried privately for long enough, become almost impossible to hand over to anyone else without feeling as though you are somehow betraying the private ritual of carrying them alone. Eventually, as it always does, the fear loosens its grip. She feels her own breathing slow to match her husband's, feels the deep, banked warmth of the room finally doing its quiet work on her, and somewhere in that gradual softening she lets her hand relax around the small scrap of fabric, though she does not put it back beneath the pillow just yet. She will before she finally drifts off completely. She always does. But for now, she simply holds it, this small private thread connecting her to a version of herself that existed before all of this, before the marriage and the household and the responsibilities that fill every daylight hour, and lets that connection carry her finally towards sleep. I think there is something worth carrying forward from her tonight, actually. Something that applies rather beyond the specific details of a medieval winter. Everyone in that household, everyone in any household, at any point in history, is managing some private weight the rest of the world never sees. The servant girl under the eaves has her own version of this. So does the peasant mother we met earlier, checking her youngest child's breathing in the dark. We will meet others tonight who carry their own versions too. And there is something quietly comforting, I think, in recognizing that this has always been true, that the specific fears change with the century, but the basic human experience of carrying something privately in the dark, of finding some small physical object or ritual that helps ease that weight even slightly, connects every one of these women across 7 centuries to you, lying wherever you are lying right now. Perhaps carrying something of your own tonight that nobody else quite knows about either. That is not a small thing. I do not think it should be treated as one. I want to talk more directly now about hierarchy because it shaped these sleeping arrangements far more deliberately than we have fully explored yet. And understanding it, I think, actually deepens how you picture every scene we have visited so far tonight. A manor household of any real size functioned almost like a small, self-contained society, with a structure of rank nearly as complex in its own way as the world outside its walls. At the very top sat the lord and lady whose private chamber we have already spent considerable time inside. Below them came a layer of what might be called upper servants, the steward who managed the estate's finances and daily operations, the chaplain if the household retained one, and, closer to our specific interest tonight, the senior women of the household, a lady's principal waiting woman chief among them, often a woman of gentle birth herself, sometimes a distant relation, whose position combined genuine intimacy with the lady of the house alongside clear subordination to her. This waiting woman occupied a fascinating middle position that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets. She was not a servant in the way a kitchen maid or a laundress was a servant. Her role required education, manners, an understanding of etiquette sufficient to represent the household appropriately, and she was treated in most respects with real courtesy by the family she served. And yet she was also undeniably subordinate, dependent on her position for her livelihood and often for her very housing, required to defer instantly to the lady's wishes regardless of her own preferences, sleeping, as we discussed, on that trundle bed pulled from beneath the main bed itself, in a room that was never in any meaningful sense her own. Maybe she is an unmarried woman from a family of modest gentry, sent to this household specifically to gain the experience and connections that might eventually lead to a good marriage of her own. Maybe she is older, having served this same lady for 20 years, having watched children born and, in some cases, buried, having become, over that span of time, something closer to a genuine friend than a mere employee, though the formal distance of rank never fully disappears even in the closest of these relationships. Her nights, sleeping in that trundle bed within earshot of her lady's slightest movement, carried their own particular texture of intimacy and constraint all at once, always available, never quite private, her own sleep forever secondary to the possibility that she might be needed. Below her in rank came the household's other female servants, and here the hierarchy sorted itself further still, by function as much as by formal status. The cook held real authority within her own domain, the kitchen, commanding a staff of her own in a large household, and her position, while technically servant rank, carried genuine respect and often genuinely better sleeping conditions than servants further down the ladder, since kitchen quarters positioned near the ovens tended to retain useful warmth long after the fires themselves had been banked for the night. A laundress, by contrast, whose work was physically brutal and whose position carried less prestige within the household's internal culture, often slept in less favourable quarters, further from any residual heat source, her nights considerably colder than the cook's, despite both women holding, in the broadest sense, similar formal rank as household servants. I find this internal sorting genuinely interesting, actually, because it complicates any simple story about medieval hierarchy as a single clean ladder from lord down to lowest servant. Within the servant class itself, distinctions of skill, of visibility, of proximity to the family's daily life created their own layered system of comparative comfort, comparative respect, comparative warmth on a cold winter's night. A woman's actual experience of a medieval household depended not just on whether she was noble or common, but on precisely where within an intricate web of function and favour she happened to sit. Husbands, too, shaped these arrangements in ways worth understanding more specifically. Marriage in this period, particularly among the nobility and the growing merchant classes, was rarely primarily about romantic affection, though affection certainly grew in many marriages over time, sometimes into something genuinely deep. It was first and foremost an alliance, a joining of families and lands and interests, negotiated by parents, sometimes years before the couple involved had any real say in the matter. A wife's position within her husband's household depended enormously on the specific terms of that arrangement, on her own family's standing relative to his, on whether she had yet produced the children, particularly sons, that would secure her position permanently within the family line. This mattered directly to our nighttime story, because a wife's standing shaped even something as intimate as her sleeping arrangement. A new bride, not yet having proven her fertility, sometimes occupied a more precarious position than the household's other women might assume from her formal title alone, her comfort and her voice within household decisions still, in a real sense, provisional. A wife of many years, having secured the family line with healthy children, particularly sons, generally commanded far greater authority within the household's daily operations, her word on matters ranging from the management of servants to, yes, the number of blankets allocated to which chamber, carrying real weight that a newer wife's word simply did not yet carry. I think of our noble woman from earlier then, and wonder which version of this story she might actually be living. Perhaps she is newly enough married that she still feels she is being quietly evaluated by everyone around her, her mother-in-law included, if that older woman still lives within the household. watching for any sign of the fertility and competence that will finally secure her place. Or perhaps, as I suggested earlier, she is further along, secure enough in her position after years of marriage that the counting of blankets we watched her perform is simply habit now, unclouded by any anxiety about her standing, a purely practical ritual rather than one shadowed by the deeper uncertainty a newer bride might carry alongside it. Widowhood complicated this hierarchy further still, and it is worth a moment of attention because widows occupied a genuinely unusual position within medieval society, one that does not map cleanly onto our modern assumptions. A widow of sufficient wealth and status, particularly one who retained control of significant property through her dower rights, the portion of her late husband's estate legally set aside for her support, could achieve a degree of independence almost entirely unavailable to a married woman of the same era. She answered to no husband, she managed her own household, made her own decisions about everything from finances to, again, the practical matter of how her own bedchamber was arranged and warmed through the winter months. Some medieval widows of real means chose never to remarry specifically because of this unusual independence, a choice that would have been essentially unavailable to them as either an unmarried daughter or a wife. I do not want to overstate this. Widowhood without sufficient property or family support could just as easily mean genuine precarity, particularly for women of lower status who lacked any independent means and depended entirely on extended family or, in the hardest cases, on charity to survive at all. But for a woman of real wealth, widowhood occupied a strange, singular position within an otherwise rigidly hierarchical society, and I think it is worth noticing, on a night when we are talking so much about hierarchy and status, that at least one path existed within this world for a woman to sleep, quite literally entirely on her own terms. Servants further down the household ladder experienced hierarchy in far more immediate physical terms, and none more so than in the question of who slept where within the servants' own shared quarters. Seniority mattered enormously here, in ways that mirror, in miniature, the larger structure of the household above them. The most senior maidservant in a shared sleeping space typically claimed the position nearest whatever heat source the room offered, whether that meant proximity to a chimney breast radiating warmth from the fire below, or simply the position furthest from the worst drafts entering through gaps in the roof or walls. Newer, younger servants, lowest in this internal pecking order, took whatever position remained, often the coldest spot in an already cold room, and understood, without needing to be told directly, that this arrangement would shift only as they themselves gained seniority through years of continued service, or as older servants left the household through marriage, retirement, or death. I think there is something worth noticing in all of this that goes beyond the specific medieval details. Hierarchy in this world was not an abstract social concept discussed in the daylight hours and then set aside at night. It followed everyone into their beds, quite literally shaped who slept warm and who slept cold, who slept private and who slept watched, who commanded the comfort of a room and who simply occupied whatever space remained once everyone above them had already chosen theirs. It is a small physical reminder of just how thoroughly status-structured every dimension of medieval life, right down to the most basic, most universal human need of all, the simple act of finding rest at the end of a long, cold day. Winter in this world was genuinely dangerous, and I think we should sit with that honestly for a moment before moving into gentler territory again, because the fear it produced was real, grounded in real experience rather than superstition alone. Cold itself could kill, directly, particularly the very young, the very old, and anyone already weakened by poor nutrition or existing illness, and everyone in a medieval household understood this with a clarity that perhaps only comes from having witnessed it happen to someone they knew. But cold's greater danger, statistically speaking, came less from the cold itself, and more from what it invited alongside it. Respiratory illness spread more readily through households and communities during winter. People crowded together indoors for warmth, in ways that made the transmission of illness considerably easier, and medieval medicine, however sophisticated in certain respects, had genuinely limited tools for treating serious respiratory infection once it took hold. The medieval understanding of illness itself worked through a framework we would find quite unfamiliar now, built around the theory of the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, whose balance was thought to determine both physical and temperamental health. Winter, in this framework, was associated specifically with cold and wet qualities, thought to encourage an excess of phlegm within the body, and much of the folk medicine practiced through the season aimed specifically at counteracting that particular imbalance. This is not, I want to be clear, medicine in any sense we would recognize as effective today, but it was a coherent, internally logical system that shaped real decisions about diet, activity, and treatment throughout the coldest months. And dismissing it purely as superstition, I think, misses something important about how genuinely people believed in and relied upon this framework to make sense of an otherwise frightening and unpredictable world. Warming foods and spices were considered particularly important during winter, specifically because of this humoral theory, thought to counteract the cold, wet qualities of the season. Wine mulled with warming spices, ginger, cinnamon, pepper, all considered to carry a hot, dry quality in humoral terms, appeared more frequently in winter diets among households that could afford such spices, which, it is worth remembering, were genuinely expensive imported goods in medieval England, accessible primarily to wealthier households rather than the general population. A peasant family's winter diet, by necessity, relied on whatever warming effect could be achieved through simpler, cheaper means. A hot pottage eaten at the end of a long cold day, perhaps flavoured with whatever herbs grew locally and had been dried and stored through the autumn specifically for this purpose. I want to describe a specific folk remedy now, one that shows up repeatedly in surviving medieval medical texts and household remedy books, because I think its specificity makes it more vivid than any general description could manage. For a persistent winter cough or chest complaint, a common remedy involved warming a mixture of honey, sometimes combined with vinegar or with specific herbs like horehound or coltsfoot, both plants long associated with respiratory relief in folk tradition across much of medieval Europe, and taking small amounts of this mixture regularly through the day. Honey itself, interestingly, does carry genuine soothing properties for an irritated throat, one of the rare cases where medieval folk remedy and modern understanding actually align reasonably well, even though the underlying theory behind why it was thought to work bears little resemblance to our modern explanation. Other remedies moved into territory considerably further from anything we would recognize as effective today, and I want to be honest about that, rather than presenting medieval medicine as somehow secretly sophisticated by modern standards. Amulets and charms, sometimes blessed by a priest, sometimes simply passed down through family tradition, were worn or kept nearby specifically for protection against winter illness, reflecting a worldview in which physical and spiritual health were never fully separated from one another. A sudden fever might be attributed to a chill caught through careless exposure, certainly, but it might equally be attributed to spiritual causes, an imbalance requiring prayer and blessing alongside, or sometimes instead of, any physical remedy. The fear that accompanied all of this, though, that part I think translates across the centuries with real clarity. Whatever the specific theories that shaped how it was understood, a mother listening to her child cough through a winter night carried a weight of genuine dread that any parent across any century would recognize instantly, whatever her specific beliefs about humours or blessed amulets might be. She did not have antibiotics to reach for. She did not have a hospital to take that child to if the cough worsened through the night. She had honey and herbs and prayer and her own careful attention, checking that small breathing body beside her again and again through the darkest hours, and an awareness, never spoken aloud but always present, that not every child who fell seriously ill in winter survived to see the spring. Infant and child mortality rates in medieval England, by every scholarly estimate we have, were devastating by modern standards, with a significant portion of children not surviving past their first few years of life, and winter illness represented one of the most significant contributing causes across the population as a whole. This is not a detail I want to dwell on in a way that disturbs your evening, but I do want to name it honestly, because it shapes so much of what we have already discussed tonight. The desperate care taken over blankets and warming pans and heated stones, the mother in the cottage checking her youngest child's breathing in the dark. These were not small anxieties or excessive caution. They were rational responses to a world in which winter genuinely could, and sometimes did, take a child from a family in the space of a few difficult nights. For adults, particularly the elderly, winter carried its own distinct dangers, and medieval households understood something we would recognize today as a genuine physiological reality, that cold weather placed real strain on aging bodies in ways that went beyond simple discomfort. Elderly members of a household, if fortunate enough to be part of a family that could accommodate them, were typically given priority for the warmest sleeping positions available, closest to whatever fire or thermal mass the household could offer, a practical recognition that their bodies handled sudden cold considerably worse than younger, more robust family members. Households without the resources to offer this priority, unfortunately, sometimes saw their most vulnerable elderly members succumb to winter's hardest weeks, a reality reflected in surviving parish records from later medieval and early modern periods, which show a consistent pattern of elevated mortality during the coldest winter months, particularly among the very old and the very young. I want to shift now towards something gentler though, because fear, however honestly it deserves to be acknowledged, was never the whole of how medieval people experienced winter. Alongside real danger sat real resourcefulness, a whole body of practical knowledge developed and refined across generations specifically to manage these risks as effectively as possible given the tools available. Preventive care mattered enormously, and much of it centered on simple practical wisdom that holds up reasonably well even by modern standards, however differently it might have been explained at the time. Staying dry was understood as genuinely important. Damp clothing changed as quickly as possible rather than left to dry on the body, since dampness was believed, correctly as it happens even if for different underlying reasons than medieval people understood, to significantly worsen the body's vulnerability to cold-related illness. Rest was similarly valued, an understanding that a body already tired or weakened faced greater risk from winter's demands, which meant households, where they were able, tried to ensure that even through the busy demands of the season, some genuine rest was preserved, particularly for anyone showing early signs of illness. There is a particular warmth, I think, in recognizing that so much of what kept medieval families alive through the hardest winters was not any single dramatic remedy or intervention, but rather this accumulated weight of careful, ordinary attention paid consistently night after night by mothers and wives and household women whose names history mostly never bothered to record, checking a child's breathing, adjusting a blanket, adding one more log to a fire that might otherwise burn too low before dawn. None of it dramatic, all of it in its quiet accumulated way, genuinely life-saving. Let us step back into daylight for a while now, because the nights we have spent so much time inside tonight did not simply happen on their own. They were prepared for, months in advance, through a whole season of careful, deliberate labour, and I think understanding that labour makes the nights themselves feel even richer once we return to them. Autumn, in a medieval household of any kind, was defined almost entirely by preparation, a race against the shortening days to secure everything the coming winter would demand. I want to walk you through what that preparation actually looked like, because it is more varied and more interesting than the single word harvest usually suggests. Firewood came first, in terms of sheer physical labour involved, and it began long before autumn technically arrived. Wood needed time to season, to dry out sufficiently that it would burn efficiently rather than smoking and sputtering through the winter months, which meant the felling and cutting of the household's wood supply often began as early as late summer, whenever the harvest itself allowed a household's labour to be spared from the fields for a few days at a time. In wealthier households, this work was performed by dedicated woodcutters, sometimes tenants owing this specific labor as part of their obligations to their lord, felling trees from managed woodland and splitting the resulting logs into sizes appropriate for the household's various hearths. From the great roaring fire of the main hall down to the smaller, more modest fires of individual chambers. For a peasant family, this same task fell to the household itself, husband and wife and any children old enough to help, gathering what their customary rights allowed from local woodland, supplemented wherever possible by fallen branches, by the trimming of hedgerows, by any scrap of burnable material the surrounding land could reasonably provide. I want you to picture this labor honestly because it was genuinely hard, physical work, hours spent bent over, hands blistered and eventually calloused from handling rough wood and simple iron tools, carried out in the last of the warm weather with an awareness always present that every log gathered now represented one less cold night in the depths of January when gathering would be considerably harder, the ground frozen, the days shorter still, the family's need for warmth considerably more urgent than it felt on a mild September afternoon. Once gathered, the wood needed proper storage, stacked carefully in a way that allowed continued airflow for further drying while protecting it from rain, which could undo weeks of seasoning in a single bad storm if the woodpile was left improperly covered. A well-managed household, wealthy or otherwise, took real pride in a properly stacked woodpile, and there is something almost meditative, I think, in picturing this task, the rhythmic, repetitive stacking of split logs into a neat, weatherproof mound, each piece placed with just enough care to ensure the whole structure would hold steady through months of wind and rain, before finally being consumed, log by log, through the coldest season of the year. Alongside firewood, the household turned its attention to food, and this is where autumn's labor grew even more intensive, because unlike wood, which simply needed cutting and stacking, food preservation demanded active, ongoing skill and constant vigilance against spoilage. Grain harvest came first chronologically, typically completed by early autumn, and its success or failure shaped the entire character of the coming winter more than almost any other single factor. A good harvest meant bread through the cold months, the fundamental staple of the medieval diet across nearly every level of society, while a poor harvest, whether from bad weather, disease, or any of the countless other threats to a medieval crop, could mean genuine hunger stalking a household or an entire community through the winter that followed. Grain once harvested needed threshing to separate the edible portion from the husk and stalk, then careful drying and storage in conditions that kept it safe from damp, from rodents, from the countless small disasters that could destroy a season's food supply in the space of a few careless weeks. Meat preservation followed a slightly different rhythm, timed specifically around a practice called Martinmas, occurring in mid-November when many households slaughtered a significant portion of their livestock, specifically because keeping animals alive and fed through the entire winter was often simply impractical, particularly for households without extensive stored fodder to sustain them. This slaughter produced a sudden abundance of fresh meat that needed processing almost immediately to prevent spoilage, and the methods used, salting, smoking, drying, all served the same essential purpose, drawing moisture out of the meat in ways that dramatically slowed the bacterial processes that would otherwise cause it to rot. I want to describe salting specifically, because the process itself is genuinely interesting and rarely gets much attention. Meat intended for long preservation was packed in layers with substantial quantities of salt, sometimes in barrels specifically constructed for this purpose, left for a period of days or weeks depending on the specific cut and the household's particular method, before being removed, brushed clean of excess salt, and hung to complete its curing, often in a cool, dry space specifically designated for this purpose. The resulting meat, heavily salted, kept for months without refrigeration of any kind, though it required soaking before cooking to draw out enough of the salt to make it palatable, a step that added real time and labor to even the simplest winter meal, but represented the difference between having meat at all through the cold months and having none. Smoking offered an alternative preservation method, particularly suited to certain cuts, and produced a genuinely different flavor profile that some households favored specifically for that reason, as much as for practical necessity. A small smokehouse, or sometimes simply a section of the main hearth's chimney, fitted with hooks for hanging meat, exposed the food to slow, low, consistent smoke over a period of days, drying it while also imparting the distinctive flavor and additional preservative qualities that smoke provides. I find myself genuinely appreciating how much accumulated, hard-won knowledge sat behind even this single preservation method. Knowledge passed down across generations of trial and error, refined slowly over centuries into techniques reliable enough that a household could genuinely trust its winter food supply to survive on the strength of them. Vegetables and fruits, where a household had access to them, followed their own preservation logic. Root vegetables like turnips, onions, and depending on the specific region and century, other hardy crops could often simply be stored in cool, dark conditions, a root cellar if the household had one, or sometimes simply a carefully insulated pit dug into the ground and covered against frost, where they would keep reasonably well for months provided the storage conditions remained sufficiently cool and dry. Fruits, more perishable, were often preserved through drying, apples and pears cut into slices and laid out to dry in whatever sun the autumn days still offered, or through the production of preserves using whatever sweetening agent a household could access. Honey for those who could afford it, since refined sugar remained a genuine luxury import throughout most of the medieval period, accessible primarily to the wealthiest households alone. Dairy, too, demanded its own autumn attention. Milk transformed into cheese and butter that could be stored considerably longer than fresh milk itself would ever last. A transformation that required real skill and careful attention to timing and temperature, knowledge typically held and passed down specifically among the women of a household or a community, since dairy work fell overwhelmingly within the domain of female labor across virtually every level of medieval society, from the great households down to the smallest peasant holdings. I want to pause here and notice something about all of this labor, because I think it connects directly back to everything we discussed earlier about the nights themselves. Every single element of winter comfort we walked through together, the warming stones, the layered blankets, the banked fires, the hot pottage eaten before bed, depended entirely on this preceding season of intense, careful, physical preparation. Nothing about a medieval winter's relative comfort or hardship simply happened. It was built, quite literally, log by log and slice by salted slice, through weeks of autumn labor that most of us, I think, rarely picture when we imagine this period of history. And this labor, it is worth remembering, fell disproportionately on women's shoulders in ways that domestic history has often underrepresented. While men typically handle the heavier physical tasks of felling and hauling wood, the far more intricate, time-consuming work of food preservation, the salting and drying and cheese-making, and the careful management of a household's entire winter food supply fell overwhelmingly to women, both the lady of a wealthy household directing and often personally performing this work alongside her female servants, and the peasant wife managing her family's considerably smaller but no less critical stores entirely on her own. I think of our noblewoman again here actually, and picture her not in her curtained bed but months earlier, in the height of an October afternoon, moving through her household's still room, the dedicated space many manor houses maintained specifically for this kind of preservation work, overseeing the salting of meat, the drying of herbs that would flavor winter meals and support winter remedies alike. Her hands, however gently born she might be, genuinely busy and often genuinely dirty with the physical reality of this labor. The elegant lady drawing bed curtains closed in January was, months earlier, an active, hands-on manager of an enormous logistical operation, one upon which her entire household's survival through the coming cold season directly depended. I think that context adds something real to how we understand her later, quieter moments in the dark. She earned that eventual rest in a very real sense, through months of preceding labour most of us never think to picture when we imagine a medieval lady at all. Religion, in this world, was not a separate compartment of life set apart from the practical business of surviving a winter. It was woven directly into nearly everything we have discussed tonight, shaping how people understood cold and hardship, how they prayed for protection through the dark hours, and how they made sense of suffering when it arrived despite every precaution taken against it. I want to talk first about the specific prayers associated with nightfall, because they were considerably more elaborate and more widely known than a simple generic blessing. The Compline service, the final formal prayer of the Church's daily cycle, occurring at the end of the day before rest, contained language specifically addressing fear of the night and trust in divine protection through the hours of darkness, drawing heavily on psalms that speak directly to this theme, verses about not fearing the terror of the night, about lying down and sleeping in peace, about protection granted equally in darkness as in light. In monastic communities, Compline was observed with real formal structure, sung or recited by the full community before the night's enforced silence began. In lay households, particularly wealthier ones with access to a private chaplain or at least a household member literate enough to read from a book of hours, elements of this same prayer tradition were often incorporated into the family's own nightly devotions, even if considerably less formally structured than the full monastic observance. For households without access to formal texts or clergy, and this describes the overwhelming majority of the medieval population, religious practice at bedtime took a simpler, more personal form. Prayers learned by heart in childhood, repeated now from memory, sometimes barely more than a handful of familiar phrases invoking protection through the night to come. I do not think this made the practice any less genuinely felt. If anything, there is something in the sheer repetition of it across an entire lifetime, the same simple words spoken every single night from childhood through old age, that suggests a depth of habitual, embedded faith that formal liturgy alone cannot quite capture. The Church's teachings on hardship and comfort during this period carried a real complexity worth understanding honestly, because they did not simply promise relief from suffering, nor did they treat suffering as something to be avoided at all costs. Medieval Christian theology held a genuinely nuanced view of physical hardship, one that saw certain forms of discomfort, when embraced deliberately through practices like fasting or penance, as spiritually valuable, a means of drawing closer to God through voluntary sacrifice. But this theology also drew a real distinction between chosen hardship, undertaken deliberately as spiritual discipline, and the involuntary suffering of genuine poverty or illness, which the Church consistently taught should be met with compassion and, where possible, practical charity from those with means to offer it. This distinction mattered enormously to how winter hardship was actually understood and responded to across medieval society. Charitable giving increased notably during the coldest months in many communities, almsgiving specifically directed toward those most vulnerable to winter's dangers, the poor, the elderly, the sick, reflecting a genuine theological conviction that such giving represented one of the most direct and important expressions of Christian duty available to anyone with resources to spare. Wealthy households, including the very manor households we have spent so much time inside tonight, typically maintained some regular practice of charitable distribution, sometimes formalized through specific religious observances, food and sometimes clothing or fuel distributed to the local poor at particular points through the winter season, occasions that carried genuine religious significance rather than functioning as mere social performance. However imperfectly that theological ideal was always lived out in practice, I want to describe one specific practice that I find genuinely moving, actually, connected to this same charitable tradition. In many parishes, a portion of the harvest, or its equivalent value, was specifically set aside as a tithe owed to the Church, and a portion of that tithe was in turn meant to support the local poor through difficult seasons, winter chief among them. This system, imperfect and unevenly enforced as it certainly was across different regions and different periods, represented one of medieval society's few organized mechanisms for redistributing resources toward those most vulnerable to winter's dangers, a kind of early, deeply imperfect but genuinely intentioned social safety net built directly into the religious structure of daily life, rather than existing as any separate secular institution for our noblewoman. And for women like her across medieval England, religious practice around comfort and hardship carried a particular personal weight worth noting specifically. The theological tension between valuing physical comfort as a reasonable, even necessary part of life, and viewing excessive attachment to comfort with real spiritual suspicion, shaped how even the wealthiest women thought about their own warm beds and heavy furs. Devotional literature aimed specifically at women of this class, and there was a genuine and growing body of such literature by the later medieval period, often included gentle warnings against excessive attachment to physical luxury, reminders that earthly comfort was temporary and that the soul's true rest lay elsewhere, in a heaven where, as certain popular devotional texts put it, there would be no more cold, no more hunger, no more fear of the coming night. I find something genuinely poignant in imagining our noblewoman reading, or having read to her exactly this kind of devotional passage, perhaps during a quiet afternoon, and then that same night drawing her heavy fur-lined bed curtains closed against the cold, feeling perhaps a small private flicker of guilt at how much she genuinely treasures this particular earthly comfort, despite everything the text just reminded her about its ultimate unimportance. Faith, in this period as in any other, rarely operated as a clean, uncomplicated force. It sat alongside ordinary human need and ordinary human attachment, sometimes in tension with those needs, sometimes offering genuine comfort precisely because it acknowledged and validated the fear and hardship that ordinary life so often demanded people carry. For women further down the social hierarchy, religious practice around winter carried a somewhat different emphasis, focused less on theological tension over the propriety of enjoying comfort, and more directly on practical petition, prayers for protection, prayers for a sufficient harvest, prayers that the coming winter would prove milder than the household's stores could otherwise withstand. Saints associated with particular protections were invoked with real specificity across different regions and communities. Certain saints held particular associations with protection against illness, others with protection of the harvest or of travelers facing dangerous winter roads, and households, particularly those without access to more elaborate theological resources, often maintained genuine, personal devotional relationships with these specific figures, praying to them by name through the hardest weeks of the season, sometimes maintaining small personal shrines or images specifically to support this practice. I want to mention one more element of medieval religious life connected to winter specifically, because I think it offers a genuinely warm note amid so much discussion of hardship and fear. The Christmas season, occupying roughly the 12 days between Christmas Day and Epiphany in early January, represented one of the most genuinely joyful periods of the entire medieval calendar, a deliberate sanctioned break from the austerity and labour that defined so much of the rest of winter. Even the poorest households typically managed some small celebration during this period, extra food where it could possibly be afforded, a rare period of reduced labour obligations, and communal gatherings that brought neighbours together in ways the rest of the isolated winter months rarely allowed. For our women tonight, wealthy and poor alike, this midwinter celebration offered a genuine sanctioned pause in the otherwise relentless discipline of winter survival. 12 days when the household's usual careful rationing of food and fuel eased somewhat, when singing and games and shared company briefly displaced the quiet, private vigilance that defined so much of the rest of the season. I think there is something worth holding onto in that image as we continue through the rest of tonight's story. This reminder that medieval winter, whatever its genuine hardships, was never purely an endurance test stretched unbroken from November through March. It had its warmth built into it too, deliberately, communally, at exactly the point in the season when people most needed a reason to gather together and remember that spring, however distant it still felt, was genuinely coming. Let us go back once more to those shared quarters under the eaves, because there is something happening there worth exploring more fully, something that happened in nearly identical form across virtually every household of this period, wealthy or poor, and that I think deserves real attention tonight, rather than the passing mention we have given it so far. Winter, for all its hardship, produced a particular kind of closeness among women that summer's busier, more scattered days rarely allowed. Shared beds, shared chambers, long hours spent together indoors while outdoor work slowed to whatever minimum the season demanded, all of it created extended stretches of proximity that, over the course of a hard winter, tended to deepen relationships in ways worth understanding specifically. In the servants' quarters we visited earlier, that laundress, that kitchen girl, that older woman with 20 years of service behind her, spent nearly every winter night in close physical proximity, and this proximity, whatever its practical origins in simple warmth sharing, produced real intimacy over time. I want you to picture the actual texture of a typical night in a space like this. Once the initial settling and prayers were complete and the women found themselves simply lying together in the dark, not yet asleep, the particular hour when conversation tends to loosen into something more honest than the careful, guarded talk of daylight hours spent under the watchful management of household superiors. This is where gossip lived, and I want to use that word deliberately and without any negative judgment attached to it, because gossip in this context served a genuinely important social function that goes well beyond its modern, somewhat dismissive connotation. Information about the household moved through these nighttime conversations in ways that shaped how servants navigated their daily working lives. Which of the upper servants was in a foul temper this week, and best avoided until it passed? Whether the lady of the house seemed troubled by something, and whether that trouble might mean changes to household routines worth anticipating in advance. Whether a particular young manservant had been paying attention to one of the kitchen girls in a way that suggested a courtship worth watching develop, or worth warning a friend away from, depending on what else was known about his character and his prospects. I find myself genuinely fascinated by how much practical value this nighttime information network actually held. A servant who knew through these quiet conversations that the steward was likely to inspect the kitchen stores earlier than usual this particular week could ensure everything was in proper order well before that inspection arrived, sparing herself trouble that a less informed colleague might not have avoided. Knowledge, in a household where servants held relatively little formal power, moved and accumulated primarily through exactly these informal channels, and the shared winter bed, however humble a setting it might seem, functioned as one of the most important information hubs the entire household possessed. Beyond practical information, though, something considerably deeper grew in these shared spaces over the course of a long winter, and I think this is the part worth sitting with longest. Real friendship, real loyalty, real alliances that could last years, sometimes an entire working lifetime, often took root specifically in these long, close winter nights, when women who might otherwise have interacted only briefly and formally during a busy summer day, instead found themselves with hours of uninterrupted proximity, night after night, across months at a stretch. I want to imagine a specific version of this friendship, because I think a concrete example will land more vividly than a general description alone. Two women, our laundress and our kitchen girl from earlier, arrived at this household in different years, different circumstances, and might, in a summer-dominated understanding of their working lives, have remained simple colleagues, cordial but not close, their interactions limited mostly to the practical business of shared household tasks. But across 3 or 4 winters spent sharing the same narrow bed, listening to each other's quiet late-night talk, sharing whatever small comforts either could offer the other on the hardest, coldest nights, something considerably deeper grew between them. By the 4th winter, they know each other's histories in real detail, the laundress's difficult relationship with a mother she left behind in a distant village, the kitchen girl's private hope of eventually marrying well enough to leave service entirely and establish a household of her own. They have become, in every meaningful sense, genuine friends, bonded through years of shared winter closeness in a way their daytime working relationship alone would likely never have produced. This kind of alliance carried real practical weight too, beyond simple emotional comfort. A servant with genuine friends within the household possessed real protection that an isolated servant did not. If accused unfairly of some fault, a well-connected servant had colleagues willing to speak in her defense. If genuinely ill, she had companions willing to cover her duties quietly rather than reporting her absence immediately to household superiors, buying her time to recover before facing any consequence for lost work. If she found herself in genuine personal trouble, a pregnancy outside marriage being perhaps the most serious and common example of this kind of crisis within a medieval servant's life, she had at minimum someone who already knew and already cared, someone to turn to for whatever limited practical help another servant in a similarly precarious position could actually offer. I do not want to romanticize this entirely, because these same close quarters could just as easily produce real tension and conflict, and any honest account of this world needs to acknowledge that too. Petty jealousies, real grievances over stolen blankets or perceived favoritism from household superiors, genuine personality conflicts between women forced into close, unavoidable proximity for months at a stretch. All of this existed alongside the friendships and alliances, sometimes within the very same relationships that also contained real warmth and loyalty. A shared bed did not guarantee harmony, it simply guaranteed proximity. And proximity across an entire winter's worth of nights tends to intensify whatever already exists between two people, whether that happens to be affection or friction. And very often, if we are honest about how real relationships actually work, some genuinely complicated mixture of both at once. This same pattern of winter-deepened female relationships extended well beyond the servants' quarters, worth noting, into the more formal female friendships that developed among women of higher status as well. A lady of the manor and her senior waiting woman, sharing that same intimate proximity we discussed earlier, the trundle bed pulled close beside the main bed, developed over years of shared winters, relationships that often blurred the formal line between mistress and servant in ways that daytime household hierarchy alone would never fully permit. Late at night, once the formal business of the day had concluded and the household had settled fully into its winter quiet, conversations between these two women sometimes moved into genuinely personal territory, a lady confiding a worry about her husband's health or her son's prospects that she would never discuss so openly during the more formally structured hours of daylight, her waiting woman offering comfort or practical advice with a directness that the strict etiquette of the daytime household would have made considerably harder to express. I think of our noble woman from earlier again here, actually, and wonder whether her waiting woman, whoever she might be, has any inkling of the private grief she carries, that small worn scrap of fabric tucked beneath her pillow every single night. Perhaps not. Some private griefs remain private even across years of close proximity, protected by exactly the kind of formal distance that hierarchy, even softened by genuine winter closeness, never fully dissolves. But perhaps on some particularly hard night, in some particularly unguarded moment, something of that old grief has slipped through despite her best efforts to keep it contained. A single unexplained tear noticed and gently, wordlessly acknowledged by a waiting woman wise enough not to press for more explanation than her lady seemed willing to offer. Village women, too, beyond the walls of any single household, formed their own versions of these winter alliances, gathering at shared tasks that the season still demanded, spinning wool by firelight in a communal gathering sometimes called a spinning bee in later centuries, though the practice itself stretches back considerably further, women bringing their own distaffs and spindles to a shared fire, specifically to combine the practical necessity of the work with the equally necessary comfort of company through the isolating winter months. These gatherings, like the servants' shared beds we discussed earlier, served as vital information networks and genuine sources of emotional support across an entire community of women who might otherwise have faced the isolating length of a medieval winter largely alone within their own separate households. I find something genuinely warm in all of this, honestly. A reminder that even within a world defined by real hardship and real hierarchy, women across every level of medieval society found ways to build genuine connection with one another, connection that made the hardest season of the year considerably more bearable than it would have been faced in true isolation. The cold outside those walls was real. The fear of illness, the anxiety over sufficient stores, the genuine physical hardship of the season, all of it was real too. But so was this, the quiet late-night conversation between two tired women sharing a narrow bed, the whispered confidence, the small kindness offered without being asked, the friendship that grew, slowly and almost accidentally, out of nothing more than months of shared proximity against a shared cold. That too is part of this history, and I think it deserves just as much of our attention tonight as the hardship does. Let us follow one of these households now through an entire winter day, start to finish, because I think seeing the whole rhythm laid out in sequence will help everything we have discussed so far settle into place a little more completely. Morning arrived early, even in the depths of winter, though the sun itself did not, and this mismatch between waking hour and actual daylight shaped the entire character of a medieval winter day in ways worth understanding. In a household of any size, the first person awake was typically a servant, often the same firekeeper we discussed earlier, whose responsibility included reviving the banked fire before anyone else in the household needed to face the cold morning air. This meant rising in genuine darkness, sometimes hours before the winter sun would finally clear the horizon, feeling their way to the hearth by touch and memory as much as by any actual light, and carefully coaxing those banked embers back into a proper flame using kindling set aside the night before, specifically for this purpose. I want you to picture this moment specifically because I think it is one of the more physically vivid details of the entire medieval winter routine. Cold hands, stiff from a night spent even in a servant's relatively modest sleeping arrangement, working carefully with flint and steel if the banked coals had somehow failed overnight, though this was considered something of a small household failure when it happened, since a properly banked fire should never actually need restriking from scratch. More often, the coals still held their quiet inner glow, and the firekeeper's task was simply to feed this glow patiently, small pieces of kindling first, then gradually larger pieces of wood, coaxing warmth back into a hearth that had spent the night doing its slow, steady work of keeping the worst of winter's cold at bay. Once the main hearth was properly revived, warmth began its gradual spread through the rest of the household. And this is where the earlier discussion of bed placement near chimney breasts becomes relevant again in a new way. Chambers positioned close to that main hearth, or built around a shared chimney structure, began warming almost immediately as the revived fire below did its work, while more distant rooms, and certainly any chamber with its own separate fire not yet lit, remained genuinely cold considerably longer into the morning. Rising from a warm bed into a cold room was, by every account that survives from this period, one of the more genuinely unpleasant moments of a medieval winter day, and households developed real strategies specifically to minimize this discomfort. Clothing worn the previous day was sometimes kept warm overnight, tucked beneath the outer layers of bedding where residual body heat would keep the fabric from developing the bone-deep chill that a garment left in an unheated corner of the room would otherwise acquire. Some households, particularly wealthier ones, employed servants specifically to bring warmed clothing to a lady's chamber in the morning, garments held briefly near a revived fire elsewhere in the house before being carried up, allowing her to dress in something considerably warmer than the room's ambient temperature alone would have provided. I think of our noblewoman here again, waking in that curtained bed we spent so much time inside earlier, and picture the specific sequence of her morning. A servant, likely her waiting woman or a junior maid working under that woman's direction, would have entered the chamber quietly once the household's main fire was sufficiently established, carrying warmed water for washing and, if the household's practice included it, warmed clothing as well. The lady herself would not draw back those heavy bed curtains until this preparation was already underway, delaying her own exposure to the room's still considerable morning chill for as long as reasonably possible, a small, entirely understandable indulgence that even the most disciplined medieval household routine seems to have generally permitted. Washing itself, worth mentioning specifically, followed practices that might surprise people who assume medieval hygiene was uniformly poor across the period, an assumption that is considerably less accurate than popular imagination often suggests. Washing the hands and face each morning was standard practice across virtually every level of society, using whatever water and basin a household possessed, and more thorough washing of the full body occurred regularly as well, though full bathing in a proper tub, requiring considerable labor to heat and carry sufficient water, happened less frequently, particularly through the winter months when the practical difficulty of heating enough water for a full bath, combined with the genuine risk of catching a chill afterward in a cold chamber, made the practice considerably rarer than daily washing of exposed skin. Dressing, in a household with any real wealth, involved genuine layers, and I think walking through this sequence specifically illuminates something about how medieval clothing itself functioned as a form of portable warmth, an idea we touched on earlier regarding sleep clothing but worth exploring further in the context of daytime dress. A linen undergarment first, against the skin, followed by a fitted overgarment, a kirtle in the terminology commonly used for women's dress across much of this period, and then, particularly in winter, an additional outer layer, a heavier gown, sometimes lined with fur for households that could afford it. The same minever we discussed earlier appearing again here in daytime dress just as it did in bedding, prized specifically for its exceptional warmth relative to its weight. A hood or veil covered the head, again reflecting that same intuitive understanding of heat loss through an uncovered scalp that shaped nighttime headwear as well. For a peasant woman, this same morning sequence unfolded with considerably less elaborate preparation but similar underlying logic. Layers still mattered enormously, whatever clothing the household possessed, worn in combination to maximize warmth. An outer garment of wool, often undyed or dyed in whatever cheap, readily available color the local dye plants provided, covering whatever underlayers she owned. Her mourning began, as we discussed earlier, considerably closer to the family's shared fire than any wealthy lady's separate chamber allowed, which meant less of that specific gap between waking warm and rising cold that shaped a noblewoman's more elaborate, more separated morning routine, though it also meant considerably less privacy and considerably less assistance in managing whatever discomfort the cold morning still presented. Breakfast, interestingly, was not always a fixture of the medieval day in the way we would recognize now. Many households across various levels of society ate their first substantial meal somewhat later in the morning, though something to break an overnight fast, bread with perhaps a little ale, was common enough in most households that could afford even this modest provision. Ale, worth noting specifically, was consumed far more broadly across medieval society than modern assumptions often suggest, including by women and to some degree by children, and this was not primarily about intoxication but rather about safety, since ale, having been boiled during its brewing process, was often genuinely safer to drink than untreated water from many local sources, a practical medical reality medieval people understood empirically even without any germ theory to explain precisely why boiled, fermented beverages carried less risk of illness than water drawn directly from a potentially contaminated well or stream. The bulk of the day's labor, once this morning routine concluded, shifted considerably in winter compared to the busier agricultural months. Outdoor fieldwork slowed dramatically, obviously, since the ground itself lay largely dormant through the coldest months, but this did not mean winter represented genuine idleness for anyone in a medieval household, and I want to correct that misconception directly, because it is a fairly common one. Indoor labor filled these months instead. and much of it fell specifically to women, continuing that pattern we noted earlier regarding dairy work and food preservation, extending now into the broader category of textile production that occupied enormous amounts of female labor time across virtually every level of medieval society. Spinning wool into thread, an essential precursor to any woven cloth, occupied countless hours of a medieval woman's winter days, performed using a simple drop spindle, or, in wealthier households by the later medieval period, an early spinning wheel, work that could be done while seated near a fire, making it particularly suited to the shortened, colder days of winter, when outdoor labor held less appeal and less practical purpose. Weaving itself, where a household possessed a loom, represented an even more time-intensive process, and the resulting cloth, whether kept for the household's own use or sold or traded within the local community, represented genuinely significant economic value, meaning this winter indoor labor was never merely a way of passing time, but a genuinely productive economic activity central to a household's ongoing prosperity. I think there is something worth noticing in how differently we tend to imagine medieval winter compared to how it actually unfolded. The popular image often defaults to something close to hibernation, households simply enduring the cold months in relative inactivity until spring finally released them back into productive life. The reality, as I hope tonight has made clear, involved considerably more constant, careful labor than that image suggests. Labor that shifted in character from the outdoor agricultural work of summer toward the indoor domestic and textile production that filled the winter months instead, but never actually stopped, never allowed a household, wealthy or poor, the luxury of true rest across the entire span of a long, cold season. Evening, when it finally arrived, came early in deep winter, sometimes as early as 4 in the afternoon in the depths of a northern English December, and this early darkness shaped the rhythm of the whole day in ways worth appreciating. Work that depended on daylight ended considerably earlier than it would through the long days of summer, and the household gathered once again around whatever fire and candlelight it could provide for the evening meal and the various indoor tasks, spinning and mending and quiet conversation that filled the long hours between an early winter dusk and the eventual retreat to bed that we have already spent so much of tonight exploring in careful detail. There is another woman I want to introduce you to now, because her winter nights looked entirely different from anyone we have met so far tonight, and I think her story rounds out this world in a way nothing else quite can. She is the village midwife, and on a bitter night in February, somewhere in the small hours when even the most dedicated fire has burned down to its last stubborn coals, she is woken by an urgent knock at her door. A neighbour's daughter, a young wife not yet 20, has gone into labour early, weeks earlier than expected, and the family has sent for her the moment the pains grew serious enough to leave no doubt about what was happening. Maybe she is a woman well past middle age herself, having delivered nearly every child born in this particular village, and several of the surrounding ones across the past 3 decades, her own children long grown, her reputation built entirely on skill passed down from her own mother and grandmother before her, knowledge that exists nowhere in any book because she cannot read and would not trust a book over her own hands regardless. Maybe she is younger, having taken up this work more recently, trained through years of assisting an older midwife now too frail for the physically demanding work itself, still building the reputation that will, if she is skilled and fortunate both, sustain her through decades of exactly these kinds of urgent late-night summons. She dresses quickly in the freezing dark of her own small cottage, layering everything she owns against a walk that will take her out into genuinely dangerous winter conditions, ice underfoot, a wind that cuts through wool as though it were nothing at all, and a darkness so complete that she navigates as much by memory of the path as by anything her eyes can actually make out. She carries with her a small bag containing the tools of her trade, herbs for easing pain and encouraging labour along when it stalled, clean cloth, and whatever specific items her own particular tradition of practice considered essential, sometimes including small charms or blessed objects believed to offer protection to mother and child alike. through the dangerous hours ahead since childbirth. In this period, sat at the genuine intersection of medical skill and spiritual practice, in ways that mirrored the broader medieval approach to illness we discussed earlier. I want to be honest about the real danger involved here, because childbirth in medieval England carried genuine substantial risk for both mother and child, risk considerably higher than anything a modern reader would find acceptable, and winter specifically compounded that risk in several distinct ways worth understanding. Cold itself posed a real threat to a newborn, whose small body struggled considerably more than an adult's to regulate its own temperature, meaning a winter birth demanded immediate, careful attention to warming the infant the moment it arrived, work that fell primarily to the midwife and whatever female relatives and neighbours had gathered to assist her, since childbirth in this period was almost universally an entirely female affair, men, including the husband himself, typically excluded from the room entirely, waiting elsewhere in the house, or, in the case of a peasant household with only a single room available, positioned as far to one side of that single space as circumstances allowed. The room itself, whatever its normal winter arrangement, would have been prepared specifically for this birth, with warmth as an absolute priority. Every available blanket gathered, the fire built up as high as the household's fuel supply could reasonably justify, water heated and kept ready near the hearth for the various needs that would arise through the labour and delivery both. I think there is something worth noticing in this prioritization. A household's usual careful winter fuel rationing set aside entirely for this one urgent night, because everyone present understood, without needing to discuss it explicitly, that warmth in this specific moment was not a comfort but a genuine matter of survival for the vulnerable new life about to enter the world. The midwife's actual work, once she arrived, drew on a body of practical knowledge that deserves considerably more respect than popular imagination sometimes grants it. She understood through years of accumulated experience how to assess a labour's progress, how to recognise signs of genuine danger requiring more drastic intervention, how to physically assist a difficult delivery through specific techniques passed down across generations of women practising this same essential work. Herbs played a real role too. Certain plants understood, through long empirical observation, even without any formal scientific framework to explain the underlying mechanism, to genuinely ease pain or encourage labour's progress, knowledge that modern pharmacology has, in several documented cases, actually validated as containing real, measurable therapeutic properties, even as other elements of traditional midwifery practice reflected the same limitations in medical understanding that shaped every other area of medieval medicine we have discussed tonight. I want to describe the actual atmosphere of a room like this one, because I think the sensory specificity matters here as much as anywhere else in tonight's story. Firelight, considerably brighter than the household's usual careful evening economy would permit, throwing warm, moving shadows across walls that would normally sit in near darkness by this hour. The particular smell of a birthing room, sweat and blood and the herbs the midwife has likely burned or brewed as part of her practice, mixing with the ever-present wood smoke that permeated every corner of medieval domestic life. Voices, low and steady, the midwife's own calm, practiced tone doing real work to keep the frightened young mother as settled as possible through pain that, by any honest account, was often genuinely severe, since effective pain relief in any form we would recognize as adequate today simply did not exist in this period. And beneath all of this, that same particular winter cold pressing in against the walls and windows, held back for now by the household's concentrated effort but never entirely forgotten, a constant reminder of the stakes involved should anything go wrong enough to require moving mother or infant, however briefly, out of this carefully warmed space. The young mother in our story survives her labour, and so does her child, a small daughter delivered safely somewhere in the deepest, coldest hour of the night, though I want to be honest that this outcome, however common it genuinely was never guaranteed in the way we take safe childbirth for granted today. Maternal mortality in medieval England, by the best estimate historians have been able to construct from surviving records, claimed a meaningful percentage of women across their childbearing years, a risk that shaped how women of this period understood pregnancy itself, often approaching each birth with a genuine, sober awareness of real danger that modern expectant mothers, however anxious they might feel, rarely need to carry in quite the same visceral way. I think of the midwife again here, walking home through the same bitter cold she walked through hours earlier, this time with the particular exhausted satisfaction of a difficult job completed successfully. She will sleep what remains of the night in her own cold cottage, likely alone, her own fire long since burned down in her absence, and rise again in a few short hours to whatever the following day demands of her. Because a midwife's work, unlike most other winter labour we have discussed tonight, followed no predictable schedule at all, arriving instead whenever labour itself chose to begin, regardless of hour, regardless of weather, regardless of how exhausted she herself might already be from the last urgent summons that pulled her from her own bed. There is something in her particular winter experience that I think deserves real acknowledgement. A woman whose entire professional existence involved deliberately walking out into the coldest, most dangerous hours of the season, again and again, in service of other women's most vulnerable moments, carrying knowledge that no formal institution recognized or credentialed, but that her entire community depended upon completely. She held in a very real sense more direct power over life and death within her community than almost anyone else, certainly more than most men of considerably higher formal social status, and yet her name, like so many women we have discussed tonight, almost certainly does not survive in any record beyond perhaps a brief mention in a parish register noting a birth she attended, her actual identity and individual story lost entirely to time, however profound her impact on the actual lives of the people she served. Let me take you now to a different household entirely, one we touched on briefly earlier but have not yet fully entered, because I think her particular version of a winter night offers something genuinely distinct from everything else we have explored so far. She is a widow, and her late husband, a wool merchant of real but not extraordinary means, left her upon his death with sufficient property, secured through careful legal arrangement made at the time of their marriage, that she now manages her own household entirely on her own terms. This is, as we discussed earlier, a genuinely unusual position for a medieval woman to occupy, and I want to spend some real time inside it tonight, because her night looks meaningfully different from any we have visited so far, shaped by an independence that almost no other woman in this story has access to. Her house sits within a prosperous market town, timber-framed, 2 stories, considerably more modest than the manor households we spent our earlier hours inside, but genuinely comfortable by the standards of her community, purchased and maintained through her late husband's successful trade and now hers entirely to manage as she alone sees fit. She employs 2 servants, a cook and a general maid, considerably fewer than a great manor household would require, but enough to spare her the heaviest physical labour while still leaving her, unlike the wealthiest noblewomen we discussed earlier, genuinely involved in her own household's daily management in a hands-on way that her late husband's business partners, men who deal with her now as a legitimate merchant in her own right, seem to find equal parts impressive and faintly unsettling. Maybe she is a woman in her middle years, widowed perhaps 5 years now, having weighed and ultimately declined 2 separate offers of remarriage in that time, choosing instead to retain the independence her widowhood has granted her, rather than surrender it back to a husband's authority, however comfortable either match might have proven. Maybe she is younger, widowed unexpectedly early, still working out exactly what this unusual freedom actually means for the rest of a life she had not planned to live alone. Either way, tonight, in her own chamber, in her own bed, answering to no one, she experiences winter's cold rather differently than any of the other women we have met. Her bed, while not curtained with the elaborate fur-trimmed hangings of a baron's household, still offers real comfort, good wool blankets she selected and purchased herself, A warming pan her maid prepares each evening according to instructions she herself set. A chamber positioned quite deliberately on her own instruction when she first took full control of the household's arrangements after her husband's death. In the warmest available room the house offers, a position she would not necessarily have claimed for herself, had a husband's preferences still governed the household's internal hierarchy. I find this detail genuinely interesting actually, because it highlights something worth noticing about how thoroughly gendered hierarchy typically shaped even something as basic as which room within a house was considered the primary, most privileged sleeping chamber. In a household still governed by a husband's authority, that primary chamber, and its accompanying warmth and comfort, generally reflected the household head's own preference and status, with a wife's comfort factored in as a secondary consideration, however genuinely valued she might be. In our widow's household, with no husband's authority to defer to, she simply claims that warmest room for herself directly, without needing to negotiate or persuade or quietly influence a husband's decision the way a still married woman of equivalent practical competence might have needed to do. Her nighttime ritual, once she has retired, includes elements familiar from everything we have discussed tonight. Prayers said, a fire checked, blankets arranged with the same careful attention any medieval woman brought to this nightly task. But there is a particular quality to her solitude worth noting specifically, because unlike our noble woman lying beside a husband whose breathing she knows intimately even while carrying private griefs he will never learn of, our widow lies genuinely alone. No other body's warmth to share, no husband's presence, however emotionally distant, to provide even that basic, wordless companionship through the darkest hours. I do not want to suggest this solitude was purely a hardship, because by every indication her own choices and preferences suggest otherwise. But I do think it is worth acknowledging honestly that the practical warmth of a shared bed, which we discussed at real length earlier tonight regarding both peasant families and servants' shared quarters, represented one genuine trade-off of her independence. She sleeps colder, in the most literal physical sense, than she likely did during her marriage, however much warmer her chamber's other comforts might otherwise be, and she has, over her 5 years of widowhood, developed her own particular strategies for managing this specific gap. Extra blankets she would not have needed with a husband's body heat beside her, a second warming stone some nights when the cold felt particularly severe, small practical adaptations to a solitude that her formal independence granted her but that her physical comfort, in this one specific respect, still had to accommodate. There is a particular fear that visits her some nights too, different in character from our noble woman's old grief over a lost brother, though perhaps not entirely unrelated to it. Hers is a fear about her own vulnerability. A woman alone in a house at night, with only 2 servants, themselves women, for protection should anything genuinely threatening occur. Medieval towns, whatever their general order and community structure, were not free of real danger, and a household without a man's formal authority and physical presence sat, by the assumptions of this period, in a somewhat more exposed position than one with a husband present. Whatever the practical reality of how much actual physical protection a merchant husband might genuinely have provided against real danger in any given crisis, she has, over her years of widowhood, developed practical responses to this particular fear. A solid bar across her chamber door each night, a small blade kept within reach of her bed, not because she anticipates using it, but because its presence offers a particular kind of comfort that pure faith and prayer alone, however genuinely important both remain to her nightly ritual, do not entirely provide. I find something worth respecting in this practical self-reliance, a woman who has built through her own deliberate choices a genuinely secure and comfortable life, but who also understands clearly that this security required active maintenance rather than passive assumption, understands that her unusual independence came with responsibilities and vulnerabilities that a married woman of equivalent wealth simply did not need to personally manage in quite the same direct way. Her days, worth mentioning briefly before we move on, reflected this same active management. She oversaw her late husband's remaining wool trading interests directly, corresponded with business contacts, made real decisions about buying and selling that shaped her household's ongoing prosperity, work that would have been considered entirely inappropriate for a married woman of equivalent status to handle so directly, but that widowhood, stripping away a husband's formal authority over her affairs, opened to her almost by default. She was, in every meaningful sense, a genuine businesswoman operating within a medieval market town, a role considerably more common historically than popular imagination typically credits, since surviving records from medieval English towns document numerous widows continuing their late husbands' trades successfully, sometimes for decades, building genuine prosperity entirely through their own management and decision-making. I think there is something worth carrying forward from her particular story tonight. A reminder that medieval women's lives, whatever the very real constraints of this deeply patriarchal period, were not uniformly constrained in identical ways across every circumstance. Widowhood, however it arrived through genuine loss and genuine grief, created real space, for some women at least, for a version of independence and self-direction that marriage itself rarely permitted. And our widow, lying in her own bed on her own terms tonight, however genuinely alone in the most literal sense, represents one particular version of what a medieval woman's winter night could look like, when circumstance, however painfully it arrived, happened to grant her real authority over her own life. I want to shift gears slightly now and talk about courtship, because winter, for all its hardship, carried its own particular romantic texture worth exploring, one that shaped how young medieval women experienced this season in ways quite different from everything we have discussed so far. The long, dark evenings of winter, when outdoor agricultural labor slowed and households gathered indoors for extended stretches around whatever fire and candlelight they could provide, created genuine social opportunity that the busier months of the agricultural calendar rarely allowed. Village gatherings, whether the communal spinning sessions we mentioned earlier or more explicitly social occasions tied to the Christmas season's sanctioned break from ordinary labor, brought young unmarried people together in circumstances that permitted at least some degree of supervised interaction. Glances exchanged across a crowded room, conversation conducted under the watchful but not entirely restrictive presence of parents and neighbors. I want to describe one specific occasion in real detail, because I think the particularity of it will bring this whole subject into sharper focus. In many English villages, a specific evening gathering, sometimes tied to a particular saint's feast day falling within the winter months, brought young people together for an evening of games, singing, and the kind of light-hearted social interaction that daily agricultural labor left little room for through the busier seasons. Blind Man's Buff, a game involving one blindfolded player attempting to catch and identify the others, appears repeatedly in surviving accounts of medieval winter entertainment, along with various other games involving forfeits, small tasks, or penalties assigned to whoever lost a particular round. It created exactly the kind of low-stakes physical proximity and playful interaction through which genuine courtship often quietly began. Maybe our young peasant woman, the one we might imagine as perhaps 16 or 17, old enough to be genuinely considering marriage but not yet formally promised to anyone, attends exactly this kind of gathering on a cold December evening, her breath visible in the frosty air as she walks with a group of other young women from her own household toward the barn or open hall where the evening's festivities will unfold. She has dressed with unusual care for the occasion, her best kirtle, however modest it might be by any wealthy standard, her hair arranged with more attention than an ordinary working day would ever receive, because she knows, without anyone needing to say it directly, that a particular young man from a neighboring farm, one whose family holds land adjoining her own father's, is likely to attend as well, and she has noticed over the past several months at various shared community occasions that he has noticed her too. I find myself genuinely charmed by this detail, actually, this recognizable universal texture of early romantic interest playing out across 7 centuries of distance, the careful outfit choice, the hope of a particular person's attention, feelings that would be entirely legible to any modern teenager, despite everything else about this world being so genuinely foreign to our own experience. Courtship, whatever its formal, legal, and economic dimensions, which we will discuss in a moment, still contained this genuinely human element, actual attraction, actual hope, actual nervousness, playing out within whatever social structures the period made available for its expression. The formal legal reality of medieval marriage, though, particularly among the peasant and lower merchant classes, operated somewhat differently than the elaborate parentally arranged unions we discussed earlier regarding the nobility. Among ordinary people, genuine mutual consent between the two individuals actually marrying carried real legal and religious weight, a principle firmly established within medieval canon law, which held that a valid marriage required the free consent of both parties rather than simply parental arrangement alone, however much parental approval and practical economic negotiation still shaped. In practice, who actually ended up considering whom as a realistic marriage prospect in the first place? This meant courtship among ordinary medieval people, while certainly shaped by economic practicality, family approval, and community expectation, still involved genuine individual choice and genuine individual attraction in ways that a purely transactional, parent-arranged model does not fully capture. Young people met at exactly these kinds of communal winter gatherings, at church, at market, through the ordinary overlapping business of village life, and developed genuine preferences and genuine interest that then had to be navigated through the practical negotiations, dowry arrangements, family approval, economic viability that any serious medieval marriage prospect required before actually proceeding toward a formal betrothal. I want to describe betrothal itself specifically because it carried genuine weight in this period, functioning as considerably more than a simple modern engagement. A formal betrothal, sometimes called a handfasting in various regional traditions, involved a spoken exchange of consent between the couple, often witnessed by family and community members, and in many understandings of medieval canon law, this exchange, if properly conducted using the correct present-tense language of consent, actually constituted a legally binding marriage in itself, even before any subsequent church ceremony took place. This created real legal complexity that occupied considerable attention within medieval ecclesiastical courts. Cases where the exact wording used during a betrothal exchange determined whether a couple was, in fact, already legally and sacramentally married, sometimes to the surprise and considerable inconvenience of both families involved. Winter weddings themselves, worth noting, occurred somewhat less frequently than weddings held during the warmer months, for entirely practical reasons that connect directly back to everything we have discussed tonight about the season's genuine hardship. Travel for guests, wedding feasts requiring provisions that were, by this point in the season, considerably more depleted than they had been in the abundant days following autumn's harvest, and the simple practical difficulty of hosting any large gathering during a period when a household's resources were stretched thin, managing its own basic winter survival, all pushed most medieval weddings toward the more abundant months of late spring, summer, and early autumn instead. But winter weddings still occurred, particularly when practical circumstances, an unexpected pregnancy, a family's urgent need to formalize an alliance, or simply two people whose families had already completed the necessary negotiations and saw no particular reason to delay further, made an immediate winter marriage the more sensible choice regardless of the season's general inconvenience for larger celebrations. I want to imagine our young peasant woman's eventual wedding night then, because it connects directly back to everything we have already explored tonight regarding the physical realities of medieval winter comfort, now viewed through the lens of a genuinely new and significant life transition. If her marriage, negotiated successfully after that winter courtship we imagined earlier, takes place the following winter, Her wedding night unfolds within all the same practical realities we discussed at such length earlier tonight. A bed prepared and warmed as carefully as the young couple's combined households could manage, blankets counted and arranged, perhaps a heated stone tucked at the bed's foot by a mother or mother-in-law, eager to ensure the young couple's first night together passed as comfortably as circumstances allowed. There is something genuinely tender in imagining this specific moment. A young woman lying beside a husband she has chosen, at least in significant part, through her own genuine preference and attraction, feeling for the first time that particular warmth of shared body heat we discussed at such length earlier regarding peasant families and servants' shared quarters, except now experienced within the entirely new context of marriage and genuine romantic partnership rather than simple practical necessity. I think of her lying awake slightly longer than exhaustion alone would explain, genuinely happy, genuinely nervous, gradually feeling her new husband's steady breathing beside her settle into the rhythm of actual sleep, and finding her own breathing, almost without conscious effort, beginning to match it, the same physical synchronization we noted regarding our noblewoman and her husband earlier, except here experienced for the very first time, still new enough to feel remarkable rather than simply routine. This is, I think, one of the genuinely hopeful threads running through everything we have discussed tonight regarding medieval winter. This reminder that even within a season defined so heavily by hardship and careful survival, ordinary human joy, romantic hope, genuine new beginnings continued unfolding right alongside all of it. Woven into the same cold nights and careful rituals we have spent so much of tonight exploring, winter did not pause human connection or human hope simply because it demanded so much careful attention toward basic survival. If anything, I suspect the season's genuine hardship made these moments of warmth, romantic and otherwise, feel considerably more vivid and considerably more treasured than they might have in an easier, more abundant season, precisely because everyone involved understood at some basic level exactly how much careful effort and good fortune it actually took to arrive at a warm bed, a full stomach, and a beloved person's steady breathing beside you on any given cold winter night in this genuinely demanding world. Let us slow down here for a while and go back once more to that first night we spent together, the tower chamber, the servants' quarters beneath the eaves, the small cottage huddled close around its dying fire. I want to sit inside all three a little longer now, because there is a storm moving in tonight, and I think watching how each household responds to it will bring everything we have learnt so far into sharper, gentler focus. The wind picks up sometime past midnight, first as a low, distant sound, barely distinguishable from the ordinary creak and settle of a cold house, then gradually building into something with real presence, a steady pressure against the manor stone walls that makes even that solid structure seem, for the first time tonight, faintly vulnerable. Our noblewoman wakes to it slowly, not startled exactly, simply drawn up from the edge of sleep by a change in the quality of sound surrounding her sealed bed curtains. She lies still for a moment, listening, that scrap of fabric still held loosely in one hand, and something in the wind's particular pitch, rising and falling against the tower's exposed height, reminds her briefly of her old fear before she manages to set it aside again, reaching instead for the practical reassurance of the curtains drawn fully closed around her, the layered blankets, the husband breathing steadily beside her, entirely undisturbed by a wind that troubles her considerably more than it troubles him. 2 floors below, in the servants' quarters, that same wind finds every small gap the old roof tiles have never quite managed to seal, and the 4 women sharing that narrow bed feel it directly now, a thin, cold current moving across exposed skin wherever the blankets have shifted or thinned through the night's ordinary restlessness. The oldest among them, the one with 20 years of service behind her, wakes first, as she nearly always does on nights like this, some instinct honed across 2 decades of exactly this kind of weather alerting her before the wind itself grows loud enough to wake the others. She reaches without fully waking herself, adjusting the shared blankets with the particular unconscious competence of someone who has done this exact small task hundreds of times before, tucking a gap closed here, pulling a corner back into place there, restoring the careful thermal seal their combined bodies have built up across the earlier hours of sleep. I want to pause on this specific action for a moment, because I think it says something real about how deeply embodied this whole system of winter survival actually became for people who lived it their entire lives. She does not fully wake to perform this adjustment. Her body simply knows, through years of accumulated habit, exactly what a shifted blanket feels like against exposed skin, exactly how to correct it with minimal disturbance to her own returning sleep or the sleep of the women beside her. This is not conscious skill in the way we might think of a deliberately learned technique. It has become something closer to instinct, the same category of automatic bodily knowledge that lets a modern person adjust their own blanket in the depth of sleep without ever fully waking to do it, except here the stakes of getting it right carried genuine weight that our own comfortable modern nights rarely require us to consider. Further out still, in that small peasant cottage, the storm announces itself considerably more dramatically because there is so much less solid structure standing between the family and the weather itself. The wattle and daub walls, however carefully maintained, shudder faintly under particularly strong gusts, and the thatched roof overhead produces a whole symphony of sound entirely absent from the more solid manor house, individual straws shifting and occasionally lifting slightly before settling back into place. A sound like continuous, quiet rustling that never quite stops through the worst of the storm's passage. Our young mother wakes fully this time, not simply stirring at the edge of sleep, but genuinely alert, because a storm of this intensity carries real practical concern for a household living this close to the elements. She lies still for a long moment, listening carefully to the specific character of the wind and rain, assessing through experience rather than any formal knowledge whether this particular storm poses genuine risk to the roof's integrity or represents simply an unusually loud but ultimately manageable winter night. Satisfied, eventually, that the sounds she is hearing fall within the range of ordinary bad weather rather than anything more genuinely dangerous, she settles back down, drawing her children slightly closer against her, that same protective positioning we discussed earlier now serving double duty, shielding the little ones not just from cold, but from whatever residual anxiety the storm's noise might otherwise produce in half-woken young minds. I find myself genuinely moved by the specific quality of alertness required to live this closely connected to the actual physical world, a level of environmental attunement that most of us, living now in houses built to standards that make a storm's exact intensity almost irrelevant to our basic safety, have simply never needed to develop. She knows this storm in some real embodied sense, the way you or I might know a familiar piece of music, able to distinguish immediately between its ordinary passages and anything genuinely unusual within it. A skill built entirely through years of exactly this kind of attentive winter listening. The storm continues for perhaps 2 hours before it finally begins to ease. And I want to describe that easing specifically because there is something genuinely peaceful in how a storm's departure typically unfolds, a gradual softening rather than any sudden stop. The wind's pitch drops first, that high, insistent whistling around exposed corners and edges settling into something lower and considerably less urgent. The rain, if the storm carried rain rather than simply dry, bitter wind, which was equally common in the depths of an English winter, thins from its heaviest downpour into something closer to a steady patter, then finally into an intermittent, gentle sound that feels, after the storm's peak, almost soothing by comparison. In all 3 of our households now, this easing produces a similar quiet response, a collective, largely unconscious relaxation as bodies that had been braced, however slightly, against the storm's uncertainty finally release that tension back into genuine sleep. Our noble woman's breathing deepens again, matching her husband's steady rhythm more completely than it had through the storm's worst hour. The servants beneath the eaves settle back into the particular collective stillness of four women genuinely fully asleep, their earlier adjustment to the shifted blankets having done its quiet work, restoring the shared warmth that had briefly been disrupted. And in the cottage, our young mother finally allows her own vigilance to ease, her children's breathing beside her steady and untroubled, the storm's passage confirmed, at least for tonight, as nothing more than ordinary hard weather rather than any genuine threat to her family's safety. I want to hold you here in this particular quiet for a while, because I think this is exactly the kind of moment tonight's story has been building toward, this deep, settled stillness that follows a storm's passing, three separate households across three entirely different circumstances, all arriving, more or less simultaneously, at the same basic state of relieved, restored rest. Whatever separated these women through the rest of this story, wealth, status, the particular texture of their individual fears and hopes, this moment dissolves at least some of that distance. They are, each of them, simply bodies finding their way back to sleep after a hard night's weather, the same basic human experience playing out in a curtained tower bed, a shared servant's mattress, and a straw pallet beside a peasant hearth, connected by nothing more than the same storm passing overhead and the same deep universal relief that follows its quieting. The rest of the night, once the storm has fully passed, unfolds in the kind of undisturbed quiet that deep winter nights at their best actually offer, hour after hour of steady, settled sleep, broken only by the occasional shift of a sleeping body finding a more comfortable position, the faint, distant sound of some night creature moving through the frozen landscape outside, entirely unbothered by any of the small, careful dramas playing out within the walls it passes. I think there is something worth appreciating in this extended, quiet stretch, this reminder that for all the genuine hardship and genuine danger we have spent so much of tonight discussing honestly, the actual lived experience of most medieval winter nights for most people on most occasions was simply this: quiet, ordinary, a household settled and breathing steadily through the dark, waiting, without any particular drama, for the slow return of another winter dawn. There is one more household I want to bring you into tonight, because it operated under an entirely different set of rules from everything we have discussed so far, and I think it offers a genuinely distinct perspective on how medieval women experienced the cold winter months. Picture a convent now, a community of women who have chosen, or in some cases been placed by their families, into a religious life devoted specifically to prayer, contemplation, and service, existing largely separate from the secular hierarchies of household and marriage we have spent so much of tonight exploring. Winter within these walls followed its own particular rhythm, shaped as much by the formal structure of monastic prayer as by the practical demands of the season itself. Maybe she is a woman who entered this community relatively young, perhaps as a second or third daughter whose family could not provide the dowry a good secular marriage would have required, finding within convent life not the constraint some might assume, but a genuine vocation she has come, over years of practice, to value deeply in its own right. Maybe she is older, having entered later in life, perhaps as a widow choosing this particular version of independence over the alternative we explored earlier of managing a secular household entirely alone. Either way, her winter nights unfold according to a schedule considerably more rigid and more communal than anything we have encountered so far tonight. The monastic day, worth understanding specifically, divided into a series of formal prayer services called the Divine Office, occurring at set hours throughout both day and night, a rhythm that shaped everything about how a religious community experienced time itself. Matins, the office observed in the deepest hours of night, typically somewhere around 2 a.m, required the entire community to rise from sleep, dress, and gather in the convent's church for a period of prayer and psalm singing, before returning to bed for whatever remaining hours of sleep the schedule allowed before dawn's arrival brought the day's first formal office. I want you to picture this specifically because I think it represents one of the more genuinely distinct experiences of medieval winter night we have explored tonight. Our nun, deeply asleep in a shared dormitory considerably more austere than even the servants' quarters we visited earlier, wakes not to any natural rhythm of her own body but to a bell, rung by whichever sister holds that particular week's responsibility for waking the community, and rises immediately however genuinely reluctant her still sleeping body might feel, because the discipline of monastic life demanded exactly this kind of consistent obedience to the schedule regardless of personal comfort or preference. The walk from dormitory to church, through unheated stone corridors in the deepest cold of a winter night, represented a genuine physical trial that surviving monastic accounts from this period discuss with real, honest acknowledgement rather than any pretense that this discipline came easily. Some communities permitted additional layers of clothing specifically for this nighttime journey, a warm cloak thrown over the sleeping habit, thick stockings against the cold stone floor, practical accommodations that even the strictest monastic discipline generally recognized as necessary, rather than as some failure of proper spiritual rigor. But the church itself, a large stone space with minimal heating even by the modest standards the rest of the convent maintained, offered little relief from the cold once the community actually arrived and began the office itself. Voices rising in the familiar Latin psalms, breath visible in the candlelit air, hands sometimes genuinely numb with cold by the time the office concluded and the community could finally return to the relative warmth of their dormitory beds. I find myself genuinely moved by the sheer discipline this required. Honestly, night after night, year after year, decade after decade, for women who spent their entire adult lives within this particular rhythm. There is something worth respecting in a devotion sustained not through occasional dramatic sacrifice, but through this relentless, ordinary, physically uncomfortable repetition, rising into genuine winter cold in the middle of nearly every single night across an entire adult lifetime, motivated by a faith deep enough to sustain that kind of consistent physical discomfort without, by every surviving account, any serious consideration of abandoning the practice. The dormitory itself, once the community returned from matins, offered considerably less individual comfort than any of the households we have visited so far tonight, reflecting monastic values that generally viewed excessive physical comfort with real theological suspicion, an idea we touched on earlier regarding our noble woman's own complicated relationship with her furs and blankets, but taken here to a considerably more disciplined extreme. Individual beds, simple wooden frames with a straw mattress and modest woolen blankets, sufficient for genuine survival through the cold but deliberately lacking the elaborate curtained enclosures, the fur linings, the warming pans that characterized wealthy secular households. This was not accidental austerity. It reflected a genuine, deliberately chosen theological position that excessive attention to physical comfort represented a distraction from the spiritual focus that monastic life was specifically organized to cultivate. And yet I want to be honest that this austerity was rarely absolute even within the most disciplined religious communities, and surviving records from various English convents across this period document real, practical accommodations made specifically for winter's genuine severity. Additional blankets permitted during the coldest months, sometimes a modest fire maintained in a communal warming room, called, in the terminology many monastic communities actually used, the kale factory, a specific space set aside where members of the community could gather briefly to genuinely warm themselves during the hardest stretches of winter. A practical acknowledgement that even the most disciplined spiritual life required some accommodation to basic physical survival. I think there is something worth noticing in this specific detail. The kale factory, a dedicated warming room built directly into monastic architecture, because it suggests a considerably more practical, considerably less punishing approach to winter cold than popular imagination sometimes assumes when picturing medieval religious discipline. These were not communities seeking to punish their members through genuine physical danger. They were communities managing a real seasonal challenge with the same careful, practical attention to comfort and survival that shaped every other household we have visited tonight, simply calibrated toward a considerably more modest baseline of acceptable comfort than a wealthy secular household would have considered sufficient. The relationships among women within a convent, worth mentioning briefly, developed their own particular texture, shaped by this shared discipline and shared physical hardship in ways that echo, though do not exactly replicate, the servant friendships and alliances we discussed at length earlier tonight. Sisters who had lived alongside one another for years, even decades, rising together in the middle of countless winter nights, sharing the particular cold walk to matins and the particular relief of returning afterward to whatever warmth their simple beds could offer, developed bonds of genuine intimacy and mutual support that surviving convent records, however formal and impersonal their official language typically remained, sometimes hint at through small details. A note of genuine grief recorded at a particular sister's death, evidence of one sister nursing another through illness, with real personal devotion beyond what strict duty alone would have required. I want to close this particular thread of tonight's story by returning to our nun herself, lying finally back in her simple bed after matins has concluded, the deep cold of that unheated church walk still lingering faintly in her hands and feet even beneath her modest blankets. She says a final private prayer before allowing herself to drift back towards sleep, grateful, in whatever specific words her own private devotion takes, for the relative shelter this cold stone building still provides against the considerably harsher winter night beyond its walls, and for the particular hard-won peace that comes from a life organized so completely around a purpose she has chosen and continues, even in this uncomfortable middle-of-the-night moment, to genuinely believe in. Her winter looked nothing like our noblewoman's furs and warming pans, nothing like our peasant mother's desperate physical closeness with her children, nothing like our widow's careful, independent self-sufficiency. And yet here she is too, another medieval woman finding her own particular way through the same long, cold season, settling back into whatever rest the remaining hours of night still offer her before the bell rings again, calling her back into the next formal rhythm of her chosen life. Let us slow down even further now, because I want to bring you gently toward the far end of this long winter, toward that particular point in the season when the coldest nights, though certainly not finished with their work entirely, begin to carry the first faint suggestion that spring, however distant it still feels, is genuinely coming. Candlemas, observed on the 2nd of February, marked this turning point in the medieval calendar with real specific significance, a feast commemorating the presentation of Christ in the temple, but carrying alongside its religious meaning a whole layer of practical, seasonal folklore that shaped how ordinary people understood the winter's remaining course. Candles blessed specifically for this occasion, hence the feast's common name, were carried home afterward to be lit through the remaining weeks of dark, cold weather, believed to offer particular protection through whatever hardship still lay ahead before spring's actual arrival. There is a particular piece of folk wisdom associated with this day that I find genuinely charming, one that has survived in various forms right down into more recent traditions we might actually recognize. The weather observed on Candlemas itself was thought to predict the character of the remaining winter, a clear, bright Candlemas suggesting more hard weather still to come, while a grey, overcast Candlemas was taken as a hopeful sign that the worst of winter had already passed. I think of our women tonight, each in her own household, glancing out at whatever sky greeted this particular February morning, reading it with the same mixture of hope and practical caution that shapes how any of us, even now, watch for the first genuine signs that a hard season is finally beginning to loosen its grip. For our noblewoman, this point in the calendar carried practical significance beyond the purely symbolic. Household stores, carefully managed since autumn's careful preservation work, had by now been drawn down considerably, and the specific state of those remaining stores, how much salted meat still hung in the storeroom, how much grain remained against the weeks still ahead before any new harvest could possibly arrive, shaped real, practical calculation about how carefully the household needed to continue rationing through whatever weeks of winter remained. I think of her walking through her still room on some quiet February afternoon, taking careful stock alongside whatever servant managed these details day to day, feeling something between relief and continued vigilance as she assessed exactly how much longer her careful autumn preparations would need to sustain the household she was responsible for. For our peasant family, this same calculation carried considerably higher stakes, and February, by most historical accounts of medieval agricultural life, represented one of the genuinely hardest stretches of the entire year, precisely because it fell at exactly this point of maximum depletion. Autumn's harvest long since consumed or nearly so, spring's first new food still weeks or even months away depending on the specific year's weather. Hunger, real and genuine, stalked many peasant households most acutely during exactly this late winter period, a reality historians sometimes call the hunger gap. And I want to acknowledge this honestly rather than let tonight's story soften it into something gentler than it actually was for many families across medieval England, particularly following any autumn where the harvest itself had proven insufficient. And yet, even within this genuine hardship, I think there is something worth holding on to. A particular quality of hope that seems to have accompanied this specific stretch of the calendar even amid real material difficulty. The days, however slowly, were undeniably lengthening now, each one carrying a few more minutes of actual daylight than the one before, a change subtle enough to escape notice on any single day but unmistakable across the accumulated weeks since the darkest point of the year had passed in late December. Birds, even in the depths of an English February, began showing the first faint signs of returning activity, and anyone who spent real time outdoors gathering whatever remained of the winter's dwindling fuel supply, tending whatever livestock a household still maintained, noticed these small signals and drew from them whatever hope the genuine remaining hardship still permitted. I want to describe one more specific tradition connected to this turning point in the year, because I think it captures something genuinely beautiful about how medieval communities managed the psychological weight of a long, hard winter's final stretch. In many regions, the period around Candlemas marked the point when agricultural preparation for the coming spring genuinely began. Seed grain assessed and prepared, tools mended and readied, the whole rhythm of household and community labour beginning its gradual shift from winter's inward-focused survival mode toward the outward, forward-looking preparation for another agricultural year. There is something worth appreciating in this practical psychology, a community that understood, even without any formal concept of what we might now call mental health, that hope itself required active cultivation, that simply enduring winter's remaining weeks passively, without any forward-looking activity to anchor a person's attention toward better days ahead, made the hardship considerably harder to bear than actively, deliberately beginning to prepare for the season that would eventually, inevitably follow. Our widow, managing her own independent household through this same stretch of calendar, approached these late winter weeks with her own particular blend of practical calculation and genuine anticipation, assessing her own remaining stores with the same careful attention any household required at this point in the season, while also, I imagine, beginning to think ahead toward the resumption of her wool trading business once spring's improved travel conditions made the roads passable again for the merchants and carters her livelihood depended upon. There is a particular satisfaction, I think, in imagining her sitting by her own well-tended fire on some late February evening, account books spread before her, already planning the specific transactions and negotiations that would occupy her considerable energy once winter's genuine grip finally, fully released the countryside from its hold, and our nun, within her convent's disciplined rhythm, experienced this same seasonal turning through her community's own particular lens, the liturgical calendar itself beginning, around this same period, its gradual movement toward Lent and eventually toward Easter, the Church's own great celebration of renewal and new life arriving, by design at exactly the point in the natural year when winter's genuine hardship was finally, gradually, beginning to loosen its grip on the wider world beyond the convent's walls. I think of her, on some cold but subtly less brutal February night, walking that same familiar path to matins, noticing perhaps, for the first time in months, that the air itself carried some faint quality slightly less punishing than it had through December and January's deepest cold, a small physical signal that even her disciplined, deliberately austere life could not help but register, and in whatever quiet way her particular devotion permitted, genuinely welcome. I want you to sit with this feeling for a while now, this particular quality of hope that arrives not through any dramatic change, but through the accumulated weight of small signals, each one modest on its own, together suggesting that the hardest part of something genuinely difficult has finally, definitively begun to pass. It is, I think, one of the most universal human experiences imaginable, this particular relief, recognizable across 7 centuries of distance and every possible difference in circumstance, wealth, and daily life. Whatever hard season you yourself might be moving through right now, in whatever specific form your own life presents it, I hope there is something worth borrowing from these women tonight, this reminder that even the longest, coldest stretches eventually begin, however gradually, however subtly at first, to turn back towards something gentler. The remaining weeks of winter, worth acknowledging honestly, still held real difficulty for every household we have visited tonight. March, in many ways, could prove just as genuinely harsh as anything January or February had already delivered, sometimes harsher still, unpredictable weather that refused to follow any tidy calendar logic regardless of what Candlemas folklore might have suggested. But something had shifted nonetheless, some fundamental quality of the season's psychological weight, the specific knowledge carried now by every person in every household across this entire story, that the very worst of it, statistically if not always literally, had likely already passed, and that whatever remained, however difficult, was leading somewhere, toward planting and growth, and eventually, inevitably, toward the particular abundance and relative ease that an English summer, whatever its own distinct challenges, would eventually provide. Before we bring tonight's story toward its close, I want to spend a little more time with the small objects that filled these women's winter nights, because I think there is something genuinely revealing about a period of history in the specific, physical things its people kept close beside them in the dark. Let us start with something we mentioned only briefly earlier, the salt cellar, because it carried a significance in this period that goes considerably beyond its simple practical function. Salt itself, remember, represented genuine value in medieval society, essential not only for flavouring food but for the entire preservation system we discussed at length regarding autumn's winter preparations, and a household salt cellar, often a genuinely well-crafted piece of household equipment, sometimes made of pewter or, in wealthier households, silver, occupied a position of real symbolic importance at the table, positioned specifically to mark the boundary between those of higher and lower status seated for a shared meal, a phrase, sitting above the salt or below the salt, that survives right down into modern English specifically because of how deeply this particular piece of household equipment once mattered to how medieval people understood and displayed social hierarchy. I mention this here in our discussion of nighttime objects because that same salt, carefully guarded and rationed through the winter months, connected directly to the physical survival we have spent so much of tonight exploring. A household's remaining salt supply, assessed alongside grain and preserved meat during exactly the kind of February stock-taking we discussed a moment ago, represented a genuine concrete measure of how securely that household could expect to manage its remaining preserved food through whatever weeks of winter still lay ahead, since salt-preserved meat, once that supply of salt itself ran short, could not be properly maintained or replenished until new supplies became available, typically only once trade routes and travel improved with spring's arrival. The distaff too deserves real attention here, because it represented, for countless medieval women, an object literally never far from their hands through the long winter months we have spent tonight exploring. This simple tool, typically a wooden staff around which raw wool or flax fibre was wound, held in one hand while the other hand drew fibre from it to be spun into thread using a weighted spindle, was so thoroughly associated with women's domestic labour that the very word distaff came to represent, in medieval and early modern English usage, the entire female side of a family line. a linguistic legacy that survives in occasional modern usage right down to today. I want you to picture this specific object resting beside a woman's bed, or perhaps tucked into a basket kept near her usual seat by the fire, ready to be picked up again the moment some spare moment through the evening or the following day presented itself. For our peasant woman, our servant even, to some degree our noble woman herself, whose position did not exempt her from at least some engagement with this essential domestic craft, the distaff represented hours upon hours of accumulated winter labour, thread spun steadily through countless firelit evenings, eventually accumulating into enough raw material to support whatever weaving the household's needs required. There is something worth appreciating in the sheer patient accumulation this represented. Single threads, spun one at a time across months of careful, repetitive work, eventually becoming entire lengths of finished cloth sufficient to clothe a family or, in a prosperous household, to sell or trade for genuine economic benefit. Needlework, too, filled countless winter evening hours across every level of medieval female society, though its specific character varied enormously depending on a woman's status and resources. A wealthy noblewoman might work fine embroidery, sometimes genuinely elaborate, using silk thread and occasionally gold or silver wire worked into decorative patterns on clothing or household textiles. Work that required real skill and represented in the finest examples genuine artistic achievement that surviving pieces from this period, where they exist in museum collections today, continue to demonstrate through their remarkable painstaking detail. A servant or peasant woman's needlework, by necessity, focused more on practical mending, repairing worn garments, patching household linens, extending the useful life of fabric that represented real hard-won value within a household's limited resources. I think of our noble woman again then, in some quiet evening hour before the more elaborate nighttime ritual we spent so much of our earlier time exploring, seated near her chamber's fire with a piece of fine embroidery in her hands, working steadily at some decorative pattern, perhaps intended for a new gown, perhaps for a religious purpose, an altar cloth or vestment donated to her household's chapel or a nearby church, her needle moving with the same patient, accumulated skill that had been developed across years of practice beginning, most likely, in her own childhood under whatever mother or governess had first taught her this essential feminine accomplishment. There is a particular object I want to describe now that connects directly back to our noblewoman's private grief, because I think returning to it here, among all these other physical objects that filled medieval women's winter evenings, gives it renewed weight. That small scrap of fabric, worn soft with years of handling, tucked beneath her pillow each night, represents its own category of object entirely, something held not for its practical or economic value, but purely for its emotional weight, a physical anchor to a memory and a grief she has never spoken aloud to anyone. I think there is something worth noticing in how differently these various objects functioned within these women's lives. Some purely practical, the salt cellar, the distaff, some blending practical function with genuine artistic and economic value, the fine embroidery, and some, like her small scrap of fabric, carrying no practical function whatsoever, existing purely as a vessel for private emotional meaning that no observer encountering the object itself without knowing its history would ever guess at. Medieval material culture, in other words, was never purely functional, however much practical necessity certainly shaped most of what any household actually possessed. Even within a world of genuine material constraint, where every object represented real accumulated labor and real economic value, space still existed for objects that served no purpose beyond the purely emotional, the purely private, and I find something genuinely moving in that fact. A reminder that human beings, whatever century they happen to live in, whatever material constraints shape their particular world, always find room somewhere for exactly this kind of private, treasured meaning. Books, worth mentioning briefly, occupied their own particular category within wealthy households specifically, genuine luxury objects painstakingly copied by hand before the later medieval introduction of printing technology, and correspondingly rare and valuable. A wealthy noblewoman's book of hours, a personal prayer book containing the specific devotions appropriate to different times of day, sometimes represented one of her most treasured personal possessions, occasionally beautifully illustrated with painted decoration, and passed down, in many surviving examples, as genuine family heirlooms across multiple generations. I think of our noble woman possibly owning such a book herself, kept perhaps in a small chest near her bed, consulted during those formal evening prayers we discussed earlier, its pages worn soft at the edges from years of careful, regular handling, another small object carrying weight considerably beyond its simple physical presence for women without access to this kind of literacy and material wealth. And this describes the overwhelming majority of medieval women across every level of society below the genuine nobility and wealthiest merchant classes. Memory itself served the function that a book of hours served for their wealthier counterparts. Prayers and stories and practical knowledge held entirely within an oral tradition passed down mother to daughter across generations, a form of inheritance considerably less visible to modern historians working primarily from surviving physical records, but no less genuinely valuable to the women who carried and transmitted it across their own lifetimes. I want to close this particular thread of tonight's exploration by asking you to think for just a moment about whatever small objects might be near you right now, in whatever room you are currently lying in. Perhaps something purely practical, perhaps something that carries private meaning nobody else in your life fully understands, the way our noblewoman's small scrap of fabric carried meaning she never shared with anyone around her. I think there is something quietly comforting in recognizing this particular thread of continuity, stretching across 7 centuries of otherwise enormous change, this very human tendency to surround ourselves, even amid genuine hardship, even within genuinely constrained material circumstances, with small objects that hold meaning far beyond their simple physical presence. There is one more small tradition I want to share with you before we let this long night finally rest, because it connects so much of what we have already discussed into a single, quietly beautiful practice. In many English households, regardless of wealth, a specific ritual accompanied the very last task of a winter evening, performed after the fire was banked, after the prayers were said, after every other small preparation for the night was already complete. It was called, in various regional traditions, setting the house to rights, a final walk through the home's main rooms, checking that doors were properly secured, that nothing had been left too near the hearth that might pose a danger through the night, that every small vulnerability the household could control had genuinely been addressed before anyone allowed themselves to finally rest. In a great household, this task often fell to the steward, or sometimes to the lady herself, a final quiet circuit through halls and chambers already dim with banked fires and extinguished candles, her own small light, perhaps a single rushlight or a carefully shielded candle, the only illumination moving through an otherwise fully darkened house. I think of our noblewoman performing this exact task on some earlier evening before we ever met her tonight, moving quietly through her own household's ground floor, checking the great hall's main door, glancing into the kitchen to confirm the cook's own fire had been properly banked, before finally climbing the stairs toward her own chamber and the elaborate nighttime ritual we have spent so much of tonight exploring in detail. In a peasant cottage, this same instinct expressed itself far more simply, our young mother perhaps casting one final glance around her single room before finally settling down herself, confirming the door's simple latch was secure, that the fire had been banked as carefully as her limited fuel supply allowed, that nothing remained undone that might trouble her rest through the hours ahead. The scale of the task differed enormously between these two households, a great manor's dozen rooms against a cottage's single space, but the underlying impulse remained exactly the same, this final careful confirmation that everything possible had been done, that the household, whatever its size, was as safe and as prepared as it could genuinely be before its members finally surrendered themselves to sleep. I find something genuinely worth carrying forward in this particular ritual, actually, because I think it speaks to something true about how these women understood their own responsibility within their households. However different those households looked from one level of society to another, care in this world was not passive. It was not simply a feeling held quietly in the heart while circumstance did whatever it was going to do regardless. It was active, physical, performed nightly through this same careful checking and rechecking, this same walking of the boundaries, this same insistence on doing everything within one's power before finally allowing rest to take over. Whatever fear or worry any of these women carried into their beds each night, and we have spent tonight learning that each of them carried real fears of her own, that fear existed alongside genuine demonstrated competence, alongside real action taken, night after night, to meet whatever the coming darkness might demand. I think that is worth remembering, whatever your own version of this nightly ritual happens to look like. Perhaps you have already checked your own doors tonight, adjusted your own thermostat, glanced at your own children sleeping safely down the hall. Perhaps your version of setting the house to rights looks nothing like theirs, and yet accomplishes exactly the same quiet, essential purpose, this final confirmation that everything within your control has genuinely been addressed, that you have done what you could do, and that whatever remains now belongs to rest, and only to rest. One last detail deserves a place here too, something small and specific that I think rounds out our understanding of these winter nights in a genuinely satisfying way. Dreams themselves carried real significance in medieval understanding, considerably more than casual modern attention typically grants them. A whole body of belief, drawing on classical traditions inherited from earlier antiquity alongside distinctly medieval Christian interpretation, held that dreams could carry genuine meaning, sometimes ordinary reflections of a person's waking concerns, sometimes, in certain understandings, genuine spiritual messages worth careful attention and interpretation. Winter nights, longer and containing considerably more actual sleeping hours than the shorter nights of summer, meant medieval people across every level of society likely experienced and remembered more dreams during these months than during any other stretch of the year, and this reality shaped how the season was understood in ways beyond the purely physical cold and hardship we have spent so much of tonight exploring. I think of our noble woman once more here, wondering whether her old grief, the brother lost so many years ago, ever surfaced directly in her dreams rather than remaining safely contained within her waking, private ritual of the small fabric scrap beneath her pillow. Perhaps on certain nights she dreamed of him directly, some fragment of memory reconstructed by a sleeping mind in ways her waking thoughts rarely permitted themselves to fully revisit. Medieval people generally took such dreams seriously, sometimes discussing them with a confessor, sometimes simply carrying their emotional weight quietly through the following day, much the way any of us might still feel unsettled or moved by a particularly vivid dream long after actually waking from it. Our peasant mother's dreams, if we could know them, likely carried their own particular texture, shaped by the same daily concerns that filled her waking hours, her children's well-being, the household's dwindling stores, whatever small hopes she carried for a better outcome than the one circumstance currently offered her. There is something worth appreciating in imagining her mind continuing its careful protective work even through sleep itself, dreams perhaps rehearsing the same vigilance her waking hours demanded, or perhaps, on kinder nights, offering some temporary escape into gentler imagined territory entirely separate from her genuine daily hardship. And now, as we finally let all 5 of these women rest completely, I want to leave you with one final image, drawn together from everything we have explored across this long night. Picture, if you can, this entire landscape from some impossible height above it, the whole cold English countryside stretched out beneath a winter sky, snow perhaps settling softly over fields and forests and frozen rivers, and scattered across that vast dark landscape, hundreds of small points of banked glowing warmth, each one a household, a family, a small collection of people breathing quietly together through the same long, cold night. Manor houses and servants' quarters, peasant cottages and market town chambers, convents holding their own disciplined rhythm of prayer and rest, every single one of them doing exactly the same essential, ancient work, keeping warmth and life going through hours when the world outside offered neither freely. That is the true scale of what we have been exploring tonight, I think. Not simply 5 individual women and their particular stories, but an entire society, an entire way of life, sustained night after night, winter after winter, century after century, through nothing more dramatic than this same patient, careful, endlessly repeated human effort to keep each other warm and safe until morning. Let us bring this long night gently toward its close now, because I think we have walked through enough rooms, enough households, enough quiet private moments to have built something real together, and I want to leave you resting somewhere warm and settled before we part. Return one final time to that first chamber we visited so many hours ago, the tower room, the curtained bed, our noblewoman finally fully asleep now, that small scrap of fabric returned at last to its familiar place beneath her pillow, her breathing slow and even, matched in that quiet, unconscious way bodies sharing a bed eventually fall into, with her husband's steady rhythm beside her. Whatever fear visited her earlier in the night has settled now, folded back into whatever private place she keeps it through the ordinary daylight hours, waiting, as it always does, for some future cold night to surface again, briefly before receding once more. 2 floors below her, our 4 servants sleep on, their shared warmth fully restored after that storm's brief disruption, the particular collective stillness of exhausted bodies finally completely at rest. Tomorrow will bring its own demands, laundry and cooking and whatever small dramas the household's daily rhythm produces, but for now, in these deep quiet hours before dawn, none of that matters yet. There is only this: 4 women breathing together in the dark, their combined warmth doing its patient essential work against a cold that has, for tonight at least, been successfully kept at bay. Further out, in that small cottage we visited early in tonight's story, our young mother has finally allowed her own vigilance to ease completely, her children's steady breathing beside her the only confirmation she still needs that everyone in her small, precious family has made it safely through another hard winter night. The fire has burnt down to its last careful embers, banked precisely as it needs to be to survive until morning, and outside, the storm long since past, the countryside lies in that particular deep, frozen silence that only the darkest hours of a winter night ever quite produce. Snow perhaps beginning to settle softly over the thatched roof, over the frozen fields beyond, over the whole sleeping landscape this family calls home. Our widow, in her own comfortable chamber within the market town, sleeps soundly too, her particular independence and her particular solitude both intact, her small blade resting within easy reach beside the bed she claimed entirely on her own terms, her account books and her careful plans for spring's renewed trading season waiting patiently in the next room for whatever attention tomorrow's daylight hours will bring them. And in the convent, our nun rests in the brief remaining hours before the bell will call her again to whatever formal office the schedule next demands, her simple bed and her modest blankets sufficient, for now, to hold at bay the genuine cold of that unheated dormitory, her mind, in these final drifting moments before sleep fully claims her, likely returning to whatever quiet gratitude and quiet hope her particular devotion has taught her to carry even through the hardest, coldest stretches of the Church's long liturgical year. 5 women, 5 entirely different lives, 5 entirely different versions of what a medieval winter night could actually mean, depending on wealth, on status, on choice, on circumstance entirely beyond anyone's individual control. And yet, whatever separated them, and we have spent tonight being honest about just how much genuinely did separate them, I hope you have noticed, threading through every single one of their stories, something that connected them all just as powerfully as any difference in circumstance ever could. Each of them, in her own particular way, spent tonight quietly caring for someone, for something, through the hardest hours of a hard season. Our noblewoman counting her blankets, managing her fear, holding a small private grief close in the dark. Our servants adjusting shared blankets without ever fully waking, their bodies moving through pure accumulated habit to protect a collective warmth that kept them all safely through the night. Our peasant mother positioning her own body as a living shield against whatever cold and whatever fear might otherwise reach her children. Our widow building and maintaining entirely through her own careful effort a genuine safety and a genuine independence that this period rarely granted women so completely. Our nun sustaining through pure disciplined devotion a rhythm of care and attention that asked more of her in the coldest hours of countless winter nights than most of us will ever be asked to give. I think there is something worth carrying with you from all of this, something beyond the simple historical facts we have spent tonight exploring, the bed hangings and the warming pans and the careful hierarchy of who slept where and why. Winter in this world asked genuine, serious things of everyone who lived through it, and the women whose stories we have followed tonight met those demands, night after night, season after season, year after year, through nothing more dramatic than this same quiet, patient, accumulated attention we have watched play out across every household we visited, counting blankets, checking a child's breathing, adjusting a shared quilt without fully waking, claiming a warm room on your own terms, rising again and again into genuine cold for the sake of a devotion you have chosen to carry. None of it was easy. I do not want to leave you with the impression that this world was simply cozy and quaint, some gentler, simpler version of hardship easily romanticized from the comfortable distance of 7 centuries. The cold was real, the fear was real, the genuine danger to children, to the elderly, to anyone weakened by illness or poor fortune was real too, and I think we owe these women, whoever they actually were, whatever their real names might have been before history simply forgot to record them, the honesty of acknowledging exactly how much courage and exactly how much quiet endurance their ordinary winter nights genuinely required. But I hope too that you have felt something warmer running alongside all of that honest hardship tonight, because it was there too in every single household we visited. The particular tenderness of a warming pan run carefully across cold sheets before someone else climbs into sleep. The particular comfort of 4 bodies pressed close together against a cold no single sleeper could manage alone. The particular hope of a young woman dressing carefully for a winter gathering, watching for a particular young man's attention across a crowded firelit room. The particular satisfaction of a widow managing her own affairs entirely on her own terms, in a world that rarely granted women that kind of independence so completely. The particular hard-won peace of a woman whose entire life is organized around a devotion she continues to choose, night after night, cold walk after cold walk, because she genuinely believes it matters. All of it was real, all of it, hardship and tenderness both, wove together into these ordinary medieval winter nights, and I think that combination, difficulty and warmth existing simultaneously, inseparably within the very same lived experience, is perhaps the truest thing tonight's story has to offer you, because I suspect it describes your own life too, whatever century you happen to be living it in, whatever specific form your own particular hardships and your own particular warmth happen to take, wherever you are right now, whatever room you are lying in, whatever blanket you have pulled up around your shoulders tonight. I hope some small measure of that same quiet, accumulated peace these women eventually found is beginning to settle over you too. The lights are already low. Your body has already gone heavy into whatever surface is holding you right now. There is nothing more you need to do tonight, nothing more you need to think about, nothing left of this long story except this quiet, gentle winding down toward rest. Let your breathing slow the way theirs did, the way it always eventually does when a body finally allows itself to stop holding on to the day that has already ended. Let whatever small worry you carried into tonight settle, at least for now, into whatever quiet place you keep such things, the way our noble woman's old grief settled, briefly, back into stillness beneath her pillow. Let the sounds around you, whatever they happen to be tonight, traffic outside your own window, rain against your own glass, simply become part of the background, the way that storm eventually became nothing more than a distant, soothing patter for 3 separate households scattered across one cold medieval countryside, 700 years and an entire world away from wherever you happen to be lying right now. And yet, in this one particular respect, this slow, shared surrender into rest, not so very far away after all. Sleep well, friend. I will be here again next time whenever you are ready to come back and listen. Until then, rest easy and let the whole long night finally, gently close around you.